As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am speaking on the assumptions that I am addressing an audience that consists predominantly of liberals, that is, of my antagonists. Therefore, I must begin by explaining why I chose to do it. The briefest explanation is to tell you that in the 1930s, I envied the liberals for the fact that their leaders entered political campaigns armed not with worn-out bromides, but with intellectual arguments. I disagreed with everything they said, but I would have fought to the death for the method by which they said it, for an intellectual approach to political problems. Today, I have no cause to envy the liberals any longer. For many decades, the liberals had been the representatives of the intellect in America, if not in the content of their ideas, then at least in form, method, and professed epistemology. They claimed that their views were based on reason, logic, science, and even though they were glorifying collectivism, they projected a manner of confident, distinguished intellectuality, while most of the so-called conservatives, allegedly devoted to the defense of individualism and capitalism, went about apologetically projecting such cracker barrel sort of foxiness that Lil Abner would have found it embarrassing, the monument to which may still be seen in the corridors of the New York Stock Exchange in a costly display of statistical charts and models proudly entitled "The People's Capitalism." Today, the two camps are moving closer and merging. Just as the Republican and Democratic parties are becoming indistinguishable, so are their respective intellectual spokesmen. And while the conservatives are lumbering toward the Middle Ages in quest of a philosophical base for their views, the liberals, always the avant-garde, have outdistanced them and are now galloping on the same quest toward India of the 5th century BC, the original source of Zen Buddhism. What social or political group today is the home of those who are, and still wish to be, the men of the intellect? None. The intellectuals, in the strict literal sense of the word, as distinguished from the mystics and the neo-mystics, are now homeless refugees left behind by a silent collapse they have not had the courage to identify. They are the displaced persons of our culture who are afraid to discover that they have been displaced by their own Frankenstein monster, by the primordial proponents of brute force. As an advocate of reason, freedom, individualism, and capitalism, I seek to address myself to the men of the intellect, wherever such may still be found, and I believe that more of them may be found among the former liberals than among the present conservatives. I may be wrong. I'm willing to find out. The terms liberal and conservative are two of the emptiest sounds in today's political vocabulary. They have become rubber words that can be stretched to fit any meaning anyone cares to give them, words that can be used safely by any speaker who wants to be misunderstood in the greatest number of ways by the greatest number of people. Yet, at the same time, everyone seems to understand these two words in some foggy subverbal manner, as if they were the code signals of a dark secret guild, hiding an issue no one cares to face. When an entire culture is guilty of evasion on so enormous a scale, the first thing to do, if one does not choose to be an evader, is to identify the issues that people are afraid to see. What is it that the terms liberal and conservative have now come to hide? Well, observe a curious sequence in our intellectual trends. In the popular political usage of today, the term liberal is generally understood to mean an advocate of greater government control over the country's economy, or loosely, an advocate of socialism, while the term conservative is generally understood to mean an opponent of government controls or an advocate of capitalism. But this was not the original historical meaning of the two terms, nor their use in the 19th century. Originally, the term liberal meant an advocate of individual rights, of political freedom, of laissez-faire capitalism, and an opponent of the authoritarian state, while the term conservative meant an advocate of the state's authority, of the established political order, which was semi-absolute monarchy at the time, an advocate of tradition, of the status quo, and an opponent of individual rights. It has been observed many times that the term liberal today means the opposite of its 19th century meaning. This would not have been too disastrous intellectually if the two terms had been merely reversed and had exchanged their original meanings. But what is significant, ominously significant, is the fact that certain groups are now attempting to switch the term conservative back to its 19th century meaning, to palm it off on the public by imperceptible degrees, never bringing the issue fully into the open, hoping that people will gradually come to believe that a conservative is an advocate of authority, but of traditional authority. If semantic corruption becomes accepted on that wide a scale, if the political switch pulled on us becomes a choice between 20th century statist liberals and 19th century statist conservatives, what political system will be silently obliterated by that switch? What political system is being destroyed by stealth without letting people discover that it is being destroyed? Capitalism.
So recent media reports have said that there are discussions within the Biden administration to condition military aid to Israel if it invades Rafah as a way to reduce civilian casualties. So if you read those reports, the assumption is that they're talking about the U.S. threatening to cut off military aid to Israel or reducing military aid, reducing the weapon supply to Israel. But according to a report from ABC News, the U.S. might do the opposite. So this report cited U.S. officials who said that the U.S. has not made a decision on leveraging military aid. And it said that it's possible additional aid, not less, would be offered as incentive to reduce civilian casualties. So the idea that they might give Israel more weapons to reduce civilian casualties, I mean, it's completely absurd. I guess this shouldn't really be a surprise because as I've covered these reports a little bit, there's just a few of them that said the U.S. Biden was considering conditioning aid if they invade Rafah. You know, I was very doubtful of them. And I mean, if this is what they're talking about, increasing the aid, listen, we'll give you more weapons if you kill less civilians. At the same time, they're buying all of Israel's lies and propaganda, so it wouldn't really mean anything. And so U.S. officials made these comments in response to a senior Israeli official complaining that U.S. weapon shipments were not coming fast enough. This Israeli official said that in the wake of October 7th, U.S. weapons were coming very fast, but that now they are finding it's very slow. So in response to that, U.S. officials denied that there was any intentional slowdown in weapon shipments to Israel. So essentially what they said here was, no, if any, we're actually considering giving them more. You know, you see these reports about us conditioning aid. We're not doing that. We're actually considering giving them more. So John Kirby, the White House National Security Council spokesman, he was asked if there was any sort of slowdown. And his response was, quote, "I'm not going to get into the timeline for every individual system that's being provided. We continue to support Israel with their self-defense needs. That's not going to change, and we have been very, very direct about that," end quote. So British military officials advised that Ukraine should focus on defense in its ground fight against Russia in the east, while focusing on targeted strikes against Crimea and Russia's Black Sea Fleet. And this was reported by the Sunday Times. And this advice was given when British Defense Secretary Grant Shapps and UK Army Chief Anthony Radakin visited Ukraine last week. The British official said that rather than attacking, Ukrainian forces should hold the line and pull back to more favorable ground if necessary, and that they're talking about the battlefield in eastern and southern Ukraine. But they're saying that this will allow Ukrainian forces to focus their efforts on the Black Sea and Crimea, where their forces, with the help of Western long-range missiles, have hit targets over the past 6 months. So this is really incredibly provocative to think about. You have these high-level British officials going over there and telling Ukraine, you know, those missiles we gave you, keep in Crimea and Russia's Black Sea Fleet with them. And attacks on Crimea have always been considered a red line for Putin, but that hasn't stopped Ukraine's Western backers from facilitating and supporting them. And this visit came after that recording of German military officers talking that was published by Russian media revealed that the British troops in Ukraine, on the ground in Ukraine, are helping them fire the Storm Shadow missiles, which have a range of 155 miles. I was looking just through TASS media reports. TASS is one of the Russian state media outlets, just searching, Storm Shadows in Crimea, and there was multiple reports of Ukraine using them in attacks on Crimea. And the UK has also helped Ukraine strike Russian ships in the Black Sea. There was another recent report from the Times that credited Rodikin, who again is the head of the British army. They credited him with the Ukrainians' strategy to destroy Russian ships, with basically helping create that strategy to destroy Russian ships. And Ukrainian attacks on Crimea and territory inside the Russian mainland have increased a lot over the past few months, as it's been clear Ukraine cannot win on the battlefield. Since Russia captured the strategic Donetsk city of Avdiivka last month, Russian forces have been making steady gains in the east, and Ukraine is suffering from serious manpower and weapon shortages. But they want to use these longer-range missiles that they have from NATO. So Niger announced on Saturday that it was suspending military cooperation with the U.S. and that the U.S. presence in the country was no longer justified, signaling that the U.S. will have to withdraw its troops from Niger. So Colonel Major Amadou Abderrahmane, who's a spokesman for the military-led government, made the announcement after a U.S. delegation visited Niger. He said that the U.S. officials did not show respect for Niger's sovereignty. He said, quote, Niger regrets the intention of the American delegation to deny the sovereign Nigerian people the right to choose their partners and types of partnerships capable of truly helping them fight against terrorism, end quote. So this is a big deal because the U.S. has a big drone base in Niger known as Air Base 201, which costs over $100 million to build, and it's used as a hub for U.S. operations in West Africa. And before Mohamed Bazoum was taken out of power last July, the U.S. had about 1,100 troops in Niger. As of December, the U.S. had 648 troops stationed in the country. So the U.S. formally declared that the ouster of Bazoum was a coup, which requires the suspension of U.S. military aid. But the U.S. was looking for ways to cooperate with the junta to maintain its military presence.
Before we get to that threat assessment, which with the process of which I know you're familiar, you at one point participated in them. What do you think happens when Ukraine to NATO when Ukraine loses this war to Russia? It's really a defeat of NATO, is it not?
It is, and NATO will never be the same. Now, it will take years to dissolve or dissipate. That mostly has to do with the bureaucracy. There are a lot of good jobs at NATO. There are a lot of really fancy buildings and so forth. But it's pretty much gone because what Biden is saying to them, even very publicly, look, we're not going to put soldiers, troops in Ukraine, okay? Well, that means that these Swedes and these Finns that were relying on the U.S. to come in with troops and everything else in case they're attacked, in the unlikely case they're attacked, well, maybe that was a bad idea to come into NATO. What's NATO worth to these people anymore if the United States will not put troops on the ground? Now, if Putin wanted to go into Poland, I don't know why you do that, or into the Baltic states or any other NATO member, then it would be the automatic putting in place of that mutual defense obligation. He had no intention of doing that. And when people ask him, am I going to do that? He keeps saying, put your move. Why would I do that? What? That doesn't make any sense, okay? So it's all kind of, it's political. It's designed to show that the Europeans are doing their part, They're willing to seize Russian assets, at least the interest of the Russian gold that's in Brussels now. They're willing to raise the notion that Macron might be supported by people like the Poles and like the Baltics in putting troops in Ukraine. But once they do it, Putin is saying, look, you people, don't you get it? Once you do that, you're at war with Russia, okay? And we have all manner of ways to take care of you, even places like Paris, Berlin, wherever, we can strike them. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a nuclear weapon. If push comes to shove, it could be, but these weapons are so accurate and they're so powerful, these hypersonic missiles, that they would use those first, I'm pretty sure, rather than risk the kind of escalation that would go to a nuclear war.
What assessments say about North Korea, Ray?
Well, they said that North Korea has a bunch of weapons that they tested, a lot of liquid-fueled weapons, but and they have a solid fuel weapons, which is Hwasong-18, period. Now, this latest weapon, which has now been tested, has been given to them by Vladimir Putin and the Russians. It is one of their late model ICBMs. It has chaff containers and everything else, decoys to defy ABM systems, and most important, it's mobile. So unless you find it right before it fires this missile,
how far can it go? Can it reach Los Angeles?
It can reach Miami Beach or Palm Beach. It can reach all of the continental United States. Now, they've had that capability before, but never from such a sophisticated weapon. I am shocked that Vladimir Putin would give this to any other country, North Korea especially, maybe. But he's done it, and nobody's willing to face into that, except some of the advisors I have who have been around a long time and know what this means, and tell me, look, Ray, this is really dangerous, because unless Putin has some sort of fail-safe device built into the software, the North Koreans are free to use this thing.
Well, what do we do when Putin gives a weapon of this destructive magnitude and capability to a crazy person?
We ignore it. This was raised 6 months ago, first on this program, actually. And Jacob Sullivan was asked about it 3 days later. And he said, oh, yeah, we're having our intelligence people look at it. Nothing since then. There have been attempts to deride this analysis of Ted Postal and others who know what end is up on this stuff. But there's been no addressing this. It's too embarrassing. You know, the Russians would do it. You know, you would think they would try to blacken the Russians by doing this, but it's really kind of interesting that they shy away from saying, look, this is what we have wrought. The Russians are so angry and so eager to have a manifold retaliatory capability that even the North Koreans now are in receipt of, well, the next to most sophisticated ICBM that the Russians produce.
Back to the threat assessment before we finish. Does it tell the president how many troops from foreign countries are on the ground in Ukraine? How many French, how many Germans, how many Poles?
You know, I don't think it does, but the Ministry of Defense in Moscow just 3 days ago said there were, see if I remember this, 36,000 foreign volunteers, foreign mercenaries in Ukraine, 6,000 of whom have been killed. That, I think, is what the Ministry of Defense said. I may be wrong on the threat assessment, but I don't recall it being included in the threat assessment.
But so we're talking about mission capable versus combat capable. And this is what this article says. Within the environs of the military-industrial congressional complex, mission capable is a highly ambiguous term that allows for a whole lot of gaming of the accountability metrics. It's worth noting that at a 55% mission capable rate, the F-35 is still well below the program targets of 90%. In other words, the F-35 fleet as a whole is nowhere near meeting its mission capability goal of being able to do anything at all. But then when you talk about full mission capable, which means combat or whatever is asked of it, go to the next one. It's an even worse story. So even for someone who is an F-35 realist, the article continues, the results are shocking. Not only is the F-35 fleet's full mission capable rate in the neighborhood of 30%, and it says see page 96 of the report, the full mission capable rate of the Marine Corps F-35B was a miserable 15.5% in March of 2023. So 15% mission capable for the U.S. Marines. That means if you get into a spot of bother, you're not going to be able to rely on these planes.
What are they going to do? Build more planes, I guess. But, you know, this is something that has to be addressed. And we have the investigators there, the people who are supposed to watch things, and they're supposed to watch where does the money go? Is it well spent? And where is the equipment? And all we have to do right now, there's been an enlightenment with the American people because they watched, you know, the evacuation of Afghanistan. Yep. Rather messy. But I think it was horrible because we went in. But it was every bit as messy when they were leaving Vietnam. Yeah. You know, it's all this big bold bragging about how we're going in there and save some country here. It's in this for our national defense purposes, and so that's how we get in with all the hype. But you know, Vietnam, what a tragedy. The only thing we can say here is we've spent more money on what's going on currently, but less body bags are coming in, so they're not as visible. In Vietnam, foreign policy was measured by body bags, but still a lot of people die. Sometimes they're at our hands, and sometimes it's done and hidden because they're on the receiving end of these bombs, and we don't generally count all the civilians that die from this.
Yeah, and I was on an interview last week, and someone asked me, well, when do you think the American, middle class is going to wake up, to all of this spending? And I said, the military stuff. And they said, they're going to realize it's a ripoff. It's not patriotic. You're being ripped off, and this is the F-35 is a great example. And the other one is our next story, which is the Ukraine fiasco, is another example of the American people just being ripped off. The government has no appropriate custodial view of the money that they take from us or print from us. Put on, skip one, go to the next one, the real clear investigations. The Government Accountability Office says it is unclear if the Pentagon tracking reports of misused aid in Ukraine. And I'm just going to do the opening paragraph from this if we can put the next one on. So the GAO looked into it, and they have no idea whether the Pentagon's tracking the weapons we're sending to Ukraine. So while the Pentagon has assured Congress that no U.S. military equipment sent to Ukraine has been diverted, stolen, or otherwise misappropriated. They assured them a new report from the Government Accountability Office could not determine if the Department of Defense was tracking the allegations of misuse 2 years into the conflict. And here's a quote: "If you never look, you will never find it." A source familiar with how the report was compiled said of the worst case possibility that aid was being misappropriated. So they're saying, we have no record of the aid being misappropriated. Well, are you checking it? Well, no.
We don't record that.
Yeah.
But so, the Pentagon, they probably are lying through their teeth, but the GAO's probably half true.
Yeah.
They don't know, but you had the answer. Why don't they know? Yeah. Well, we don't look at that kind of thing. So that's why there's nothing wrong with the Federal Reserve because we've checked the records. Yeah, we check the records. Yeah, like fun. You don't check the records, so you can't say, where did some of this money go and how is this operated? Who did it benefit? So this whole idea that it's open government is, a bit of a farce. But that is one thing that I think if we could get more of a unity on demanding that, it would be better. I remember when I was working on Audit the Fed, we had a significant amount of Democrats come over to endorse the principle, and they liked the idea of openness and knowing what's going on, and they supported it. But usually there will be some patriotic explanation of why you can't do that. Secrets are very important. That's one thing that I would do if anybody asked me. I would suggest all this stuff about papers taking the papers home from your office, from the presidential office. Why don't we? I bet you could reclassify or eliminate all that activity, or reclassify a bunch of it and make it not so interesting for that to happen. I don't know what ever comes of all those records. And when you saw that Biden's garage, it looks like they might just sit in a garage and rot away.
Yeah, exactly. Next to his Corvette. Well, the thing is, I almost start wondering whether this whole thing is by design. Because if you look at this next clip, this is from the article on Real Clear Investigations. The sheer tonnage of supplies and speed of its shipment, according to the GAO report, has left the Pentagon without the quality data to assess its delivery. So if you read about that and think about it, what they're saying is basically they were in so much of a rush to provide anything and everything to the Ukrainians, they couldn't be bothered to stop and track and think about, is this something good? Is it going to fall into the wrong hands? And it's just essentially, all of this, it just follows the policy of racing into this war without thinking twice.
It is the very scale and virulence of the evasion that should make every rational person pause and consider the issue. Those who do will discover that the historical, political, economic, and philosophical case for capitalism has never been refuted, and that the only way the statists can hope to win is by never allowing it to be discussed. This is the issue hidden under the foggy sloppiness of today's political terms. Most people are not consciously aware of it. What they do sense, however, is that they haven't a leg to stand on as far as their political views are concerned, whether they're liberals or conservatives, that they have no philosophical base, no moral justification, no principles to uphold, no policy to offer. Observe the intellectual disintegration of today's political discussions, the shrinking of issues and debates to the level of single, isolated, superficial concretes, with no context, with no reference to any fundamental principles, no mention of basic issues, no proofs, no arguments, nothing but arbitrary assertions of for or against. As an example, observe the level on which the last presidential campaign was fought. Did the candidates discuss foreign policy? No, just the fate of Quemoy and Matsu. Did they discuss socialized medicine? No, just the cost and the procedure of medical aid to the aged. Did they discuss government control of education? No, just who should pay the teachers' salaries, the federal government or the states. What most people are evading today is the realization that under the lip service they are paying to an anti-totalitarian crusade, they have accepted all the basic premises of a totalitarian philosophy, and the rest is only a matter of time and degree. They do not know how they came to accept it, and most of them do not want to accept it, but they see no alternative, and they are too frightened, too bitterly discouraged to seek it. Whose job is it to offer an alternative? Who provides a country with ideas, with knowledge, with political theories? The intellectuals. But it is the intellectuals who have brought us to this state and are now deserting under fire, that is, giving up the task of intellectual leadership at a time when they are needed most. When intellectual disintegration reaches such absurd extremes as, on one side, the claim of some conservatives that the United States of America was the product of tradition worship, and on the other side, the use of a political designation such as a totalitarian liberal. Isn't it time to stop and to realize that there are no intellectual sides any longer, no philosophical camps, and no political theories, nothing but an undifferentiated mob of trembling statists who haggle only over how fast or how slowly we are to collapse into a totalitarian dictatorship, whose gang will do the dictating, and who will be sacrificed to whom. It is the non-totalitarian liberals and the non-traditional conservatives that I seek to address. Both are homeless refugees today because neither had a firm philosophical foundation under his political home. Those homes were jerry-built astride a deadly fissure. The fissure has opened wide and has swallowed all the cheap little platform planks. Let them go, and let us start rebuilding the foundations. The fissure had many philosophical names: soul versus body, mind versus heart, liberty versus equality, the practical versus the moral. But all of these are merely derivatives of one basic issue: reason versus mysticism, or, in political terms, reason and freedom versus faith and force. Let me define my terms. Reason is the faculty which perceives, identifies, and integrates the material provided by man's senses. Mysticism is the claim to some non-sensory, non-rational, non-definable, supernatural means of knowledge. Only 3 brief periods of history were culturally dominated by a philosophy of reason: ancient Greece, the Renaissance, the 19th century. These 3 periods were the source of mankind's greatest progress in all fields of intellectual achievement and the eras of greatest political freedom. The rest of human history was dominated by mysticism of one kind or another, that is, by the belief that man's mind is impotent, that reason is futile or evil or both, and that man must be guided by some irrational instinct or feeling or intuition or revelation, by some form of blind, unreasoning faith. All the centuries dominated by mysticisms were the eras of political tyranny and slavery, of rule by brute force, from the primitive barbarism of the jungle to the pharaohs of Egypt, to the emperors of Rome, to the feudalism of the Dark and Middle Ages, to the absolute monarchies of Europe, to the modern dictatorships of Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, and all their lesser carbon copies. The Industrial Revolution, the United States of America, and the political economic system of capitalism were the product and result of the intellectual liberation achieved by the Renaissance and of a predominantly Aristotelian philosophical influence, which lasted, in spite of a Platonist counter-revolution, through the centuries known as the Age of Reason and the Age of Enlightenment. With so illustrious a start, how did the United States descend to its present level of intellectual bankruptcy? I want to recommend to your attention a very interesting book which provides the material, the historical evidence for the answer to that question. I hasten to state that the conclusions I have drawn are my own, not the author's, that I disagree with the author's viewpoint, and I believe that he would probably disagree with mine. But the book is a remarkable, scholarly, well-documented record of the history of America's intellectual life. One may disagree with a writer's interpretation of the facts, but first, one must know the facts, and in this respect, the book is of enormous value. It is called The Decline of American Liberalism by Professor Arthur A. Eckert, Jr.
So Israel's plan to create a buffer zone inside Gaza along its border with Israel will take 16% of the Strip's territory. And this was reported by the Wall Street Journal, and they cited an analysis of this operation being carried out by Israel that was done by a Hebrew University geography professor. So Israel has begun the process of constructing this zone, which involves demolishing Palestinian homes and agricultural land that are in the way. And this buffer will be about 1 kilometer in width, which is about 0.6 miles. And when you're talking about an area like Gaza, a relatively small territory, that is a significant chunk of land that they're taking. So I was surprised to see that it's actually 16%. So Israeli media reported in January that Israel had destroyed 1,100 of the 2,800 buildings in these border areas that it intends to destroy. So Reuters reported last week that under the direction of then President Donald Trump, the CIA launched a covert campaign in 2019 on social media to turn public opinion in China against the government. Former U.S. officials said that Trump's authorization allowed the CIA to take action in China and in countries where Washington and Beijing are vying for influence. Operations to denigrate China on social media were carried out in Southeast Asia, Africa, and the South Pacific. The CIA also leaked disparaging intelligence to international news outlets to paint China in a bad light. So to me, that's a big part of this, saying that the CIA was leaking things to the media. If you look at 2019, 2020, there's so much negative media coverage of China. And I mean, like, even before COVID, 2019, this is when the narrative about the Uyghurs really started to kick off, and you had Mike Pompeo declare it was a genocide, even though there's no evidence of that. And, you know, this definitely makes me suspicious of those types of narratives that were pushed. There's also this big organ harvesting accusation. So the former U.S. officials speaking to Reuters, they did not offer much detail about the social media campaign, but said that CIA operatives using false identities were spreading narratives about corruption in China and about Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. The officials claimed that the actions were a response to China using covert means to spread its global influence. Reuters said that it was unable to determine if President Biden has continued this campaign. I would guess there's a very strong chance that he did, because he's taken a very hard line against China, all this military expansion in Asia, increased support for Taiwan, and all that. And Biden's CIA also opened a new spy center dedicated exclusively to China. And William Burns has been very outspoken about the CIA's work against China. He's actually just said publicly that they're rebuilding their spy networks inside China, which is something you would think he would want to keep. The CIA would want to keep quiet, but, you know, he's been talking about this stuff openly. So in response to this report, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that the CIA operations show that the U.S. uses, quote, public opinion space and media platforms as weapons to spread false information and manipulate international public opinion, end quote. China has maintained its increase in patrols near Kinmen, which are those Taiwanese-controlled islands just a few miles off the coast of mainland China, where U.S. Army Special Forces are now stationed. The Chinese Coast Guard stepped up its presence near Kinmen, known as Quemoy, in China, after 2 Chinese fishermen died last month when their boat capsized while being chased by Taiwan's Coast Guard. So according to the South China Morning Post, 8 Chinese Coast Guard vessels patrolled waters near Kinmen on Friday and Saturday. China's Taiwan Affairs Office described the patrols as a normal act because, quote, Taiwan is part of China and regular law enforcement in waters near Quemoy is the duty of the mainland Coast Guard, end quote. So Taiwanese authorities said that they warned off the Chinese vessels and they condemned the patrols, of course. The U.S. also got involved. I mean, you know, you talk about meddling in other people's affairs. So the U.S. condemned the Chinese patrols. And again, these are islands that are at certain points only 2.5 miles away from China. And you have the U.S. making statements about it. A U.S. State Department official said that China's continued provocations in waters close to Kinmen revealed its intention to unilaterally change the status quo. And this latest incident comes after Taiwan confirmed that there are American Green Berets permanently stationed on Kinmen to help train. We don't know exactly how many. It's probably a small amount, maybe a few dozen. But still, it's, you put the shoe on the other foot here. And I know, so China has kind of a reason to increase these patrols separately of U.S. troops being there, the 2 Chinese fishermen who died. And it was reported that U.S. troops were in Kinmen before that happened. So China had a reason, but maybe there's a chance that they are doing this also to kind of send a message to the U.S. like, hey, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing here? So it's just an area to keep an eye on.
You expressed a view that it's unlikely that state actors will get involved. Suppose Netanyahu does, as he's been threatening to do, attack Hezbollah. Will Iran allow that to happen without resisting it militarily? And how powerful or sophisticated is the Iran military and the weapons it has?
You know, the strange thing is Iran is very powerful militarily. And if Iran went into a full-scale war, there would be mass bloodshed in Israel and throughout the Middle East. Actually, the Iranians don't want it. They're not chomping at the bit for war. They've, in fact, faced so many provocations, so many assassinations, so many murders. Most people do not want war. They know that war destroys their societies. War leads to tragedy. War has no happy ending. Hezbollah doesn't want war. Lebanon doesn't want war. Egypt doesn't want war. Jordan doesn't want war. Syria doesn't want war. Iran doesn't want war. They actually don't want war. I speak to their diplomats. We're the ones that think war is somehow a natural thing. And Israel wants the war. Israel wants a wider war. And we've got enough dunderheads in our Congress that'll always stand up and talk about war. And we have a government adrift right now. And Israel's trying to provoke a wider war. Nobody else wants it because they know that it's tragic. It's a disaster. It should be the normal state of affairs, by the way, that people say, how do we end the war? But we don't even have that in Ukraine, a war that has gone on for well over 2 years, killed hundreds of thousands of people. You don't hear one senior American official saying, how do we end it? And we have that utter fool, Senator Lindsey Graham, now back in Kiev saying, yeah, you fight on, because he's been at the core of this warmongering for a decade, back to the overthrow, to the coup, to the Maidan. They just love throwing Ukrainians to their death in fighting the Russians because they think it somehow weakens Russia. So this idea that, yeah, it's going to trigger a wider war. Well, it could, but I can tell you, no one wants a wider war except some of our side. And we've lost track about this because the U.S. is in perpetual war. Britain loves a war. But remember, Britain was the most violent country in the world for about 200 years. Beat the hell out of everybody, because that's imperial mentality. But most of these countries don't want war. They want the United States to put a stop to its own arming of this bloodshed. It's not hard, by the way, to understand that, because every few days a vote comes up in the UN Security Council, and the U.S. stands alone in the opposition to a ceasefire or to peace or to a solution. We're alone in this. So we got to get our own heads on straight. We're the ones that prolong these wars. We're the ones that are talking about war with China. Are we crazy? We're the ones that have American soldiers in Taiwan right now. Are we crazy? Even if they're just for training, what are we doing?
We're provoking. They're there as a tripwire. One of them will get hit with a drone, and old Joe or whoever's pulling the strings.
Well, Lindsey Graham will say, now we have to have World War III.
Correct. It'll be their excuse. I know you don't like hypotheticals, but do you envision Russia or China getting involved militarily in the Middle East if Iran is attacked by Israel?
No. What I do imagine, though, is the whole world uniting against the United States and Israel as the last two countries that are in this absolute war mentality.
What will it take for that to happen? It hasn't happened yet.
It's interesting. We talk about the China threat. China has not been in any war for more than 40 years. And the last war that China was in, 1979, 1980, was a very brief skirmish with Vietnam. And that had to do with the Cambodian disaster, which the U.S. provoked. Other than that, China does not want wars. The whole idea that China is this great militaristic threat is, again, a propaganda line of our deep state. It's another game. China is superb, actually, at saying, would you calm down? Could everybody sit down? China's the one that brought Iran and Saudi Arabia together. Could the United States ever have done that? No, it wouldn't even have been in American mentality that you bring two antagonists together. Better stir the pot. That's better for the empire. But China wants it a completely different way. So what I would say is that if this war expands, what China and Russia will do is to bring the whole world along, demanding peace. And that they will be very effective in doing. And the United States' place in the world, which is just disappearing in respect and in what people are seeing, that will absolutely end up with us in complete isolation.
this next one on. This got a lot of attention yesterday. Here's the Washington Post. Lindsey Graham visiting Kiev urges Ukraine to pass mobilization law. Now, they've already lost upwards of 500,000 people in this war, but it's not enough for Lindsey Graham. Put on that next one. This is the Hedge article, and here's a quote that is worth paying attention to. On his latest of far too many visits to Ukraine, Senator Lindsey Graham on Monday urged legislators to expand the pool of citizens subject to being drafted and thrown into the country's losing war against Russia, saying, and here's a quote from Lindsey Graham, "We need more people in the line." The question is, what is he talking about? Who is we? We need more of you to go and die.
Well, he speaks from a psychological position that he believes he's one of the key kingmakers of the empire.
Yeah.
You know, no, there is no American empire. We're fighting for liberty, you know, and liberty and a constitution. So, but he sees himself, and they themselves become, you know, the authoritarians, but the experts. They're the definer of what truth is and whether or not we even should be fighting this law. They go over to fight for the Constitution. This is the irony. They go over and they say, well, we're fighting for our Constitution and our liberties to fight an unconstitutional and an immoral war. They don't even bother with the Constitution. Why are we? Oh, we're not involved. Oh no, we just finance the whole thing, and then we sneak some people in there, and then we give them all their weapons and say, "And our hands are clean. You know, we wash our hands. We have no harm. We always fight for righteousness." And that's where Graham identifies with. He believes he comes to the point he believes it, but it's demagoguery that their ultimate goal is sometimes difficult to figure. Other than because it's hard for me to put Graham in the cultural Marxist position, because I think there's a Marxist motive in a lot of what we do, especially domestically, and our administration does that. It's a Marxist system, and therefore chaos is necessary. I don't think Graham comfortably fits right into that, even though he's a co-worker, because he's causing the chaos and the bankruptcy of this country, because there's never enough bombs and things to send around the world for Graham.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's just like the this push to get the Europeans to spend more on military. You know, and Trump is big on this. You better carry your weight. You better spend that 2% of your GDP on the military or else. Well, if the Europeans really did feel so threatened by Russia, would you have to be twisting their arms and cajoling them and threatening them to spend more on their military? You know, I mean, it just shows that they really don't feel threatened. And in fact, if they were threatened, would they be giving all the weapons to Ukraine? They'd be, you know, keeping the weapons there to protect against, you know, the Russian horde that's coming. So the reality is their behavior completely is a mismatch from the rhetoric of the neocons and the pro-war faction.
Yes, and I can't see that really changing. There's not going to be any magic. I don't think they're going to get the spirit of what he's looking for. The Graham people saying, you know, we're fighting Russia. Don't you know that? I think they lose their ammunition when they are still back fighting the Cold War in 1946. You know, and the mess we've had after the war ended. So too bad. But I think that this is going to linger until there's a lot more people die, and we already know that we're involved, you know, with all the technology and all the money and all the troops. And that'll eventually end. But we also have troops in there. We have troops on the land in there, and most people recognize that. Nobody would argue, oh, there's not an American in Ukraine at all. Well, we were the first ones in there. We led the charge, and of course, and that was in 2014. They knew we were there, but this is not going to be stable for a while to come.
Yeah. Well, let's do a couple of things from this article. You put on that next clip, because here's the point of the political piece. It's no longer, as you say, Dr. Paul, about recruiting new soldiers. It's about persuading them not to quit. This week, French Armed Forces Minister Sébastien Lecornu presented a talent retention plan to incentivize military personnel to remain. This comes a few days after an annual report submitted to the German parliament showed that in 2023, some 1,537 soldiers left the Bundeswehr, reducing it to 181,514 personnel. Go to the next one now. Here is the problem they're facing. The conversations now exist in all capitals, in all democracies that are professional armies without conscription, Lecornu said on Monday. At NATO meetings, we can talk about equipment, but we also have to talk about the level of retention. And they go on to talk about the fact that there is a renewed discussion over some kind of national reservists being reintroduced. Germany got rid of conscription in 2011, but the others and Germany are thinking about bringing it back and conscripting women as well to serve. You know, that may, as much as we oppose the idea of conscription, that may bring it home to these young people that they're not playing, they're serious, they want you to die.
Yeah, you know, we've talked about this because people will pop up in this country talking about the institution of the draft. But the draft, you know, was removed in the early 70s and it was gone for a while, and then they wanted to restore registration, and that was a big fuss in the House, and they were determined to have the registration. But there, you know, it was the best part of the, you know, the Cold War. There was no, right now, there was no. At the end of the Cold War, there was no tension like we needed troops, but they went ahead and they did this, and they got the with difficulty they finally got the registration back. Why did they have to have the registration? To me, it's a psychological thing. Yeah. Because do you think in this day and age they don't know where everybody is, what their age is, and where they work, and whether they ever made a phone call to China? You know, that sort of thing. They know everything, but they had to have the registration because there would be people. You know, if things get really tough, and if this determination to fight Russia in Ukraine, if the Europeans won't do it, we run out of money, we just need more troops, they'll do it. They're not beyond it at all to do it. They're capable of doing it, and they'll think they're serving a great purpose by instituting the draft. Yeah. So I'd be concerned, but I don't think that's enough to get people worried about next year. Yeah. I hope not anyway, but they're capable. The fact is, the draft registration is there, and the ready recall is available. But let's hope the American people are awake enough to refuse to accept that.
Professor Eckert himself is a liberal, though not of the totalitarian variety. He offers no solution for the present state of liberalism and no explanation of its decline. His thesis is only that liberalism is declining and that our culture is moving toward, quote, an increasingly illiberal future, close quote. Let me give you Professor Eckert's definition of liberalism. Quote, perhaps it is best if we think of liberalism not as a well-defined political or economic system, but as a collection of ideas or principles which go to make up an attitude or habit of mind. But within this liberal climate of opinion, however broadly or narrowly it may be defined, it is necessary to include the concept of limited representative government and the widest possible freedom of the individual, both intellectually and economically. Close quote. Professor Eckert is an historian and has given an accurate description. But what a philosopher would observe is that that description holds a clue to the disaster which has wrecked Western civilization and its intellectuals. Observes that the liberals in the 19th century, as well as today, held a collection of ideas or principles which had never been translated into a well-defined political or economic system. This means that they held certain values and goals with no knowledge of how to implement them in reality, with no understanding of what practical actions would achieve or defeat their goals. With so vulnerable an intellectual equipment, could they be a match for the primordial forces of totalitarian mysticism? They could not and were not. It is they, the intellectuals, who betrayed their own liberal ideals, defeated their own goals, paved the way for their own destroyers, and did not know it until it was too late. They did not know that the political and economic system they had never defined, the only system that could achieve a limited representative government, as well as the intellectual and economic freedom of the individual, the ideal system, was laissez-faire capitalism. The guilt of the intellectuals in the 19th century was that they never discovered capitalism, and they have not discovered it to this day. If you want to know the philosophical and psychological causes of the intellectuals' treason against capitalism, I will refer you to the title essay of my book, For the New Intellectual. In the brief space of today's discussion, I have to confine myself to a mere indication of the nature and the consequences of that treason. The fundamental principle of capitalism is the separation of state and economics. That is, the liberation of men's economic activities, of production and trade, from any form of intervention, coercion, compulsion, regulation, or control by the government. This is the essence of capitalism, which is implicit in its theory and in the operation of a free market. But this is not the way most of its advocates saw or presented it, and it is not the way it was translated into practice. The term laissez-faire capitalism, which one has to use today in order to be understood, is actually a redundancy. Only an economy of total laissez-faire is capitalism. Anything else is a mixed economy, that is, a mixture in varying degrees of freedom and controls, of voluntary choice and government compulsion, of individualism and collectivism. A full, perfect system of capitalism has never yet existed in history. Various degrees of government interference and control remained in all the mixed, semi-free economies of the 19th century, undercutting, hampering, distorting, and ultimately destroying the operations of a free market. But during the 19th century, mankind came close to economic freedom for the first and only time in history. Observe the results. Observe also that the degree of a country's freedom from government control was the degree of its progress. America was the freest and achieved the most. When two opposite principles are operating in any issue, the rational scientific approach to their evaluation is to study their respective performance, trace their consequences in full, precise detail, and then pronounce judgment on their respective value. In the case of a mixed economy, the first duty of any thinker or scholar is to study the historical record and to discover what developments were caused by the free enterprise of private individuals, by free production and trade in a free market, and what developments were caused by government intervention into the economy. It might shock you to hear that no such study has ever been made. To my knowledge, no book dealing with this issue is available. If one wants to study this question, one has to gather information from random passages and references in books on other subjects, or from the unstated implications of known but unanalyzed facts. Those who undertake such a study will discover that all the economic evils popularly ascribed to capitalism were caused, necessitated, and made possible not by private enterprise, not by free trade on a free market, but by government interference into the economy, by government controls, favors, subsidies, franchises, and special privileges. The villains were not the private businessmen who made fortunes by productive ability and free trade, but the bureaucrats and their friends, the men who made fortunes by political pull and government favor. Yet it is the private businessmen, the victims, who took the blame, while the bureaucrats and their intellectual spokesmen used their own guilt as an argument for the extension of their power.
So President Biden reassured Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he was not trying to undermine him politically by criticizing the Israeli government. And this was reported by Axios on Tuesday, and Biden gave Netanyahu this assurance during a phone call on Monday, which came after Chuck Schumer gave his little speech about Israel and called Netanyahu an obstacle for peace and said that there should be elections in Israel. Biden was asked about what Schumer said, and he said that he thought he gave a good speech. So sources told Axios that Netanyahu complained about Schumer's speech and Biden's approval of it, prompting Biden to say that he was not looking to undermine the Israeli leader or intervene in Israel's domestic politics. Biden and other Democrats in the U.S. have tried to distance themselves from the Netanyahu government while also supporting Israel's mass slaughter of Palestinians and the starvation siege on Gaza. This criticism has not amounted to a policy change as the U.S. continues to provide Israel with unconditional military aid, as I am always pointing out. So this was the same call where Biden and Netanyahu agreed that Israel will send a delegation to Washington to discuss Israel's plans to invade Rafah, the Gaza city on the Egyptian border, where there are 1.5 million Palestinians. U.S. officials have been cautioning against a full-scale invasion and are suggesting a more limited operation. According to the White House, Biden expressed to Netanyahu, quote, deep concerns about the prospect of Israel conducting a major ground operation in Rafah, where more than 1 million displaced civilians are currently seeking shelter after fleeing fighting in the north, end quote. But Netanyahu said on Tuesday that he brushed aside Biden's concerns and reaffirmed that he's planning to attack the city. So this is the day after he spoke with Biden. He told members of the Knesset's Foreign Affairs Committee, quote, I made it as clear as possible to the president that we are determined to complete the elimination of these battalions in Rafah, and there is no way to do this without a ground incursion, end quote. Netanyahu said that Israel was under international pressure, but said that Israel was rejecting that pressure in order to achieve the goals that Netanyahu has set out. And we always have to keep in mind that the U.S. doesn't believe Israel can achieve those goals, namely eradicating Hamas. That's something Netanyahu always says he's going to do. U.S. intelligence doesn't think that they can do that. And Israeli intelligence, there's been signs that they don't think they could do it either. They can't destroy all of the tunnels under Gaza, and just, the way that they're fighting the war, killing all these civilians is a total recruitment tool for Hamas. So here we have, Netanyahu and Biden, trying to, put their issues aside and get along so they could continue committing these atrocities together in Gaza. So the governor of Russia's Belgorod Oblast announced Tuesday that authorities will evacuate about 9,000 children from the area as Ukraine has been stepping up attacks on Russia's border regions. So this is the governor of Belgorod. He said, quote, "A large number of villagers are being evacuated today. We are currently planning to evacuate about 9,000 children," end quote. And he said that over the past week, 16 people were killed and 98 were wounded by Ukrainian shelling in Belgorod. And I believe they're referring to artillery shelling, as well as there's been a lot of drone attacks. And he said that over 130 residential houses and 60 passenger cars were damaged as a result of Ukrainian shelling just over the past day. And he said this on Tuesday. And there was a zoo in Belgorod that said it was hit by Ukrainian shelling, and there was no people killed, but a kangaroo was killed in that attack. So Ukraine has increased its attacks on Russian territory as Russia has been gaining more ground on the battlefield. Russian forces have been making steady gains since taking the Donetsk city of Avdiivka last month. And on Tuesday, Russia said that its forces took the village of Orlivka, which is about 2.5 miles west of Avdiivka. So the Pentagon is looking to stay in Niger despite an order from the country's government for U.S. forces to leave. Pentagon spokeswoman Sabrina Singh told reporters on Monday that the U.S. was seeking clarification from Niger and is in talks with officials in the military-led government known as the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland. So this isn't really a surprise that the U.S. is saying, "Hang on a minute, we're not pulling out right away. Let's try to work something out here." So we'll see if this gets to the point where Niger is saying, "No, you have to go." And then, if things might get a little hairy there. But it looks like, again, because they have that big drone base, that's what this is all about. Airbase 201, which cost over $100 million to build. They don't want to give them up. They don't want to give that up, although they are in talks with other West African countries to base drones on their territory. But hopefully this ends with the U.S. Packing up and leaving peacefully. But we'll see how it all plays out.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
As Ukraine loses the war, they're going to increase their attacks inside of Russia, hit a nuclear power plant. We wrote this in your Trends Journal, oil refineries, anything they can to keep getting more support from the United States and NATO. And now that's happening. And now TASS reported today, the Russian news agency, their foreign minister, whoever, intelligence guy, that little Carlson Macron, the guy with a pecker thinner than his fucking pen that he'd probably like up his ass with his fake little fucking hair, sending troops, French troops to go fight in Ukraine. That's what's being reported. That means Ukraine is at war with Russia. World War III is escalating. We read what the Polish are doing. More troops, more money, more building up the military, one country after another. It's all in your magazine. So going back to the markets. Oh, the markets went up today because they're worrying about what the Fed is going to do. The Fed may hold rates tomorrow when they announce it. I would have thought they would have taken them down by now. Inflation's not going away. You're going to see oil prices are now up more than $20 than they were a month ago. Excuse me, not $20. Yeah, $20. That's right, $20 a barrel. $20 a barrel more than they were a month ago. So when you're filling up your tank, thank Congress and all the moronic little freaks going back to the markets. All things are connected. And that's what we do differently in Trends Research and the Trends Journal. Opportunity misses those who view the world through the eyes of their profession. So the markets went up today based on where they think interest rates are finally going to go. They need more cheap dough. You have a global recession. We are going into dragflation, higher inflation, and declining economic growth. But when all else fails, they take you to war. Whole trends in global economic front. When the economy falls, jobs go with it. This is our 77th week. You should see the job layoffs that are going on. This is going to have an effect on the economy because people start losing their jobs, not going to be able to pay for their rent, pay for their housing, pay their debt. Things are going to get a lot worse until they start lowering interest rates dramatically. And they're going to do it. And when interest rates go down, the dollar's going to go down and gold prices are going to go up. Private equity firms unable to sell 28,000 companies. And by the way, the private equity company groups own Wall Street. And when I was a young guy, this stuff didn't exist. It only started to happen in the mid-'80s. And now they own everything. Cities cut spending as commercial real estate tax revenues slump. Wow, what a surprise. How about office building bust that we warned about over 3 years ago? 3 years ago. And now the banking bust is happening. And there are the articles in here in your economic update and a whole review of this week's important economic news. The banks are going bust. It's being hidden in the news. And now Wall Street on Parade, which is a great site to go to by Pam and Russ Martin, they're reporting things that nobody else is in the banking sector. They're showing how they lied and shoved a lot more money into the system to artificially prop up the banks when the Silicon Conman Bank failed last March, and the other banks followed, First Republic, and how much more money they're really pumping in to keep these things up. These banks are in dire straits. By the way, your office occupancy rate, meaning how many people going to work, of the 10 largest cities in America, it came down from 52.5%. Now it's 50.7%. That's right. That's all it is. So now all the businesses that depended on commuters are going out of business. And our research is showing that things are going down in the hospitality and service sectors. It's going to hit. The people are hurting. The crash is coming. But don't worry. When all else fails, they take you to war. Your other sections that you're not going to want to miss in this Trends Journal. Again, trends in geopolitics. Again, as we warned, as Ukraine loses war, it escalates attacks inside Russia. This is just the beginning. And again, if oil prices, as Israel keeps expanding its war, bombs away deeper into Lebanon, which we're writing about, deeper into Syria, more attacks against Iran. If Iran gets involved militarily against Israel, you're going to see oil prices hit above $130 a barrel, and that's going to crash the equity markets and the global economy, and no one in the mainstream media is talking about that. No one. No peace allowed. EU's top diplomat rejects Pope's call for peace in Ukraine. Diplomat, yeah. A bunch of little shits. Trends Eye Views. Schools across the U.S. begin confiscating cell phones. Again, we're writing about this to show the decline of society and how dumb people are getting. As I said, they misspelt it in the King James Bible when they said the meek shall inherit the earth. The geeks have inherited the earth.
The corporate media lied too much, and it killed them. I had that experience. I was just saying off air at one of your speeches probably 20 years ago. I'd never seen you speak before, and you went off about the Federal Reserve. And I remember thinking, what an esoteric subject. I knew nothing about it. I thought only crazy people cared. But again, I was completely ignorant about monetary policy at the time. And I was shocked by how much the crowd loved it. They were completely tuned in. They thought it was really important. Why would the average person 20 years ago have a better sense of that than, say, me, who was paid to follow the subject but wasn't? How did people know?
I got it from literature. You could read about it. We didn't
Yes.
have an internet. We didn't have the radio or TV giving us good information, but it was out there. For one group that helped me a whole lot was Leonard Reed, the Foundation for Economic Education.
Yes.
I knew him, and he was a true believer. He was a dignified person and very likable. And he talked about process, how you reach people. And but he was very, very libertarian in his own way. But he was sort of an intellectual. And he influenced me a lot. So I read everything he did. And he did a lot of literature. But the follow-up of that was, of course, the Mises Institute. And,
Yes.
and I was part of that. And I think, I think they're important people. I know people on TV are really important.
Oh, so important.
So important. But there are a lot of people that are important. I think the ideas are the most important. And they come and go. But the ideas make all the difference in the world. I mean, I look at the need for the ideas on how our country came about. You know, Thomas Jefferson and others that knew exactly what they were talking about. But we don't have many Thomas Jeffersons around anymore. So, but there's more people. There are influence there, but there are more. But the underground, the silent majority, the remnant. I believe in the remnant both in a philosophic and a religious sense. When things deteriorate, there's always somebody there that's going to gather together 10, 12, 15, 200, or 500. They gather together and they talk about the real things that are important. And the remnant, I think, is much bigger than anybody ever realized. And I think when I walked into those stadiums, I don't know how many times I would say, where did these people come from? I was totally amazed.
I thought the same thing.
Because, I remember my goal was never to be in politics. I had no desire to be in politics, but I wanted to use politics to spread a message of personal liberty.
Yes.
And that was my goal. So that was the whole reason that I got involved. And evidently there were other people looking for the same thing. And I was impressed with how many people there were. And I got to the point where I thought young people basically were being ridiculed and made fun of, and they still get it, and some of them deserve it. But they're still young people, are very good and intellectual, and they, when I even back, it's been a while since I was a candidate. When I would mention the remnant, they knew exactly what I was talking about. Yes. People who gather together for ideological reasons, and it's it's nobody looking for to be a good lobbyist and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And Washington is so bad that somebody said, "What? How did you ever survive it?" I said, "Well, I said that I never became an optimist. I never said I'm going to cure the world. I thought the ideas were important, and that's what I wanted to do because I was very selfish. Because I thought it made me feel better talking about something I believed in.
Yes.
And then when I saw some kids at Berkeley and other schools getting up and saying, and the Fed, well, liberty is not dead at all. I think it just gets reignited, and I think we're in the early phases of that. But I also believe we have to go through rough, tumbled times because the price always has to be paid. The price in the sense, how do you liquidate the debt? We can't walk away from that debt.
But how do we liquidate the debt?
The market will liquidate it, and the way the market liquidates it is. What they'll demand is like the person that wants $50 hourly wages.
Yes.
You print money. And every time you print money, the value of the dollar goes down. So the value of the debt goes down. You just a theoretical thing. If you double the money supply and prices go up 50%, it doesn't work that way. But if you do that, the real debt it goes down. So it's a theft. It's a tax. It's evil.
So you inflate your way out of it.
Yeah, and that's what will happen. Because what won't happen is the people are going to get together and all of a sudden said, Ron, you need to go back. And yeah, sure. We need to go back and get more people. We do have some very good people in Congress, but they're pretty lonely too.
Yes.
And they're very lonely. But I think I tell people, you're not going to get 12, 24, or 100 new members of Congress. The system is so embedded with bankruptcy and corruption that that's not going to work. But I'm still an optimist because I think where it counts, where the people are studying and understanding, and they were ahead of us. I figure they were ahead of me because they said, and the Fed, it's fiat money, and so they're well along the way, and it's more available now than ever before. This information.
Yes.
So I always figure that if somebody will listen, I'll talk. But like I said, I in a way do this for sort of selfish reason because I want to do it. I get some benefit, emotional and philosophic benefit by doing it, but never as much as I expected. I mean, I always got more than I ever expected because there's more people out there wanting to change their mind. I still get hundreds and hundreds of letters. The neatest story I get are young people writing to me that they've started their own organization. And there's a freedom organization, and they're very creative. And at the end of my speeches, I used to talk about if you're listening and you agree with this, I think you have a higher moral responsibility than somebody that just doesn't know what's going on.
Right.
That you have the responsibility to put it out there, and that I think is a lot of them took me at my word, and they have started their own organization. And I think you can't stop it. An idea whose time has come can't be stopped by armies. Right. And I strongly believe that. So.
An introduction to one of the most abused parts of the Constitution, that is, the necessary and proper clause. It's also one of the most complex, which is why we were warned it would be used to expand federal power. Now, the Federalists during the time of ratification, they told us over and over and over that it wouldn't add any new power. It was what was considered a recital. Anti-Federalists warned that even if that was the truth, it was going to be expanded because it was ambiguous. And all along, even at the time of ratification, there were even 3 different views on the word or the meaning of the word necessary in this legal document from the 18th century. And if there was anything nefarious going on, I think it was with the necessary and proper clause. Let's kick it off with the text of the clause, which is Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. Here from our website. This is, again, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. A lot of people tell you that there's 17 powers delegated to the federal government of the Constitution. They're referencing Article 1, Section 8, the first 17 powers, pointing out that the 18th really isn't a delegation of power, but there are other powers delegated throughout the document, somewhere around 30 to 35. But anyways, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, necessary and proper, is often called the elastic clause or the sweeping clause because many people believe it gives the federal government power to do just about anything. They started calling it the sweeping clause during the ratification debates. However, necessary and proper doesn't actually delegate any power at all. And here from Rob Nadelson's great paper, The Agency Law Origins of the Necessary and Proper Clause, points out that this was drafted by lawyers, some of the top ones in the country at the time. The lawyers who drafted the Necessary and Proper Clause took its language directly out of contemporary agency law and usage. So agency law really goes all the way back to the common law. It's about, you can think about it in commercial law. It's about principals and agents. So if you own a business and you hire an agent to run your business, there's certain ways to approach that, what they're authorized to do, hiring people in commercial contracts, etc. Rob goes on. He says the purpose of the clause was to reinforce the role of Congress as the agent of the people, exercising implied incidental powers necessary as a legal term of art for carrying into execution their written instructions, that is the Constitution, subject to prevailing fiduciary norms, which is the proper part of it. Moreover, during the ensuing struggle over whether to adopt the Constitution, this was the meaning, without most of the legal jargon, of course, that the Federalists sold to the ratifying public. And here's from James Wilson describing the clause during the ratification debates. Again, if we want to understand the legal meaning of anything in the Constitution, we don't necessarily want to just understand what they had to think about it in Philadelphia, because those proceedings were secret. They had no impact on the legal meaning of the document. Any legal document has the same meaning today as it was understood to mean the moment it was given legal force. And the people who gave it legal force were the people of the several states in the ratifying convention. So if you want to understand how they explained it, that's what they approved. When they said, we're going to reject the idea of this, or we're going to approve the idea of this, it's based on how it was explained to them. And here's James Wilson in the Pennsylvania ratifying convention. Can the words, the Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry into execution the foregoing powers, be capable of giving them general legislative power? Of course, that's how it's treated today. They can do anything that they want, and whatever they consider necessary, whatever they consider proper, they can do whatever. In other words, unlimited power in all cases whatsoever, just like what they fought to get away from with the British in the Declaratory Act of 1766. But that was the argument against it. Wilson saying, no, the legal terms mean this. He said, I trust it is meant that they shall have the power of carrying into effect the laws which they shall make under the powers vested in them by this Constitution. He followed up a few days later, again, James Wilson. He said, it gives no more or other powers, nor does it in any degree go beyond the particular enumeration. For when it is said that Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, those words are limited and defined by the following, quote, for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. It is saying no more than that the powers we have already particularly given shall be effectually carried into execution. James Madison in Federalist 44 said, without the substance of this power, the whole Constitution would be a dead letter. If they have the power, if they've been delegated the power to establish post offices, but they don't have the ability included in that to be able to hire people to run the post office or to merely lease or buy land in order to establish that post office or pay for the wood or chop down the trees to build the building, et cetera, et cetera. So Madison is saying without the substance of this, without including this, all the delegated powers mean absolutely nothing. It would be impossible. He says in Federalist 44, basically it would be impossible to list all the various ways to carry out a particular power. And that's what we understand in agency commercial law today. If you've authorized someone to run your business, they're authorized to do the necessary and proper things in order to run that business. If you authorize them to run your corner store, you don't have to specifically spell out in the contract that they're authorized to purchase a mop to wash the floor. But if they want to buy a tire store in order to bring more foot traffic, that's a whole different story. They've taken on a power that's greater. So Madison in Federalist 44 also described the power conferred under the necessary and proper clause as, quote, indispensably necessary. And he equates this to those that are requisite, which was defined, requisite was generally defined in dictionaries at the time as essential. George Nicholas in the Virginia Ratifying Convention repeated this kind of message. He said, the committee will perceive that the Constitution had enumerated all the powers which the general government should have, but did not say how they were to be exercised. It therefore, in this clause, tells us how they shall be exercised. Does it give any new power? I say not. So in other words, the Federalists are saying this is not additional power. This is just reaffirming what the document already tells us.
Obviously, there are some differences, but nothing ever really changes.
Yeah.
You know, when it comes to big things, the establishment, the deep state, or whoever they are, you know, the programs continue no matter what they say, whether it's on war and peace, or whether it's on the FBI and security, or whether it's whatever the subject, the spending continues. So today, we're not going to solve any of those problems, but hopefully we move in that direction. Now, we want to talk about an incident, and they've had some hearings recently that occurred shortly after Biden got into the presidency, and it has to do with the closing down of the war in Afghanistan, which is still not closed down and will not be for a long time. But Politico had an interesting article out. It says Republicans fixate on messy Afghanistan withdrawal. Oh, it's Trump's fault. But Trump was out of office. Oh, it's Trump's fault. The Republicans did it. But you know, in this short introduction on Politico, they have something in here that I will be talking about more in this program. He says there's no single causal factor that determine the outcome, which is partially true, but there are some single factors that I want to consider, and that is our overall foreign policy, because it has a lot to do with that. It to me is a sad story what happened, because my solution would have prevented all this. We just should have stayed at home.
Yeah. Well, let's put on this first clip. This is from Politico, and yesterday was a hearing in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the chairman of that committee, Michael McCall, probably a decent fellow, but very, very bad political views in our opinion, very extremely pro-war. But he basically wanted to make some political points. They want to tie this albatross on the back of Joe Biden, and there's no question that it was a very messy withdrawal. But you know, McCall wants to relitigate it. But we have to remember that the U.S. invasion and occupation of Afghanistan spanned 4 presidential administrations. You know, it started under Bush, and then Obama inherited it for 8 years, and then Trump had it for 4 years. Now, Trump did want to get out, and we know this from our friend Colonel Doug McGregor, who was working for the Secretary of Defense, those chaotic last few weeks of the Trump administration. He was tasked to try to get us out of Afghanistan and Syria, and he's told the story before. He wanted to get out, but in a way, Trump's situation was even worse than the others because his own administration wouldn't let him get out. You know, they blocked him from getting out, and he didn't obviously try hard enough. But they're trying to make points now that this whole thing was going just fine. It's just that Biden messed up the departure. And let's put on the next clip, because this is the setup for the hearing. The House Foreign Affairs Committee hammered the administration on Tuesday for its 2021 withdrawal, seeking to keep the chaotic exit in the public eye, even as the 2 retired generals who oversaw the evacuation offered few new details. And that's a fair enough kind of swipe back at McCall, I think, on this. But he says, Politico writes, President Joe Biden's polls numbers tanked 3 years ago as U.S. forces left Afghanistan, especially after the ISIS suicide bomber killed 13 American service members. Republicans have since tried to make the withdrawal a political albatross to hang around Biden's neck, leading Democrats to defend him on the committee dais and beyond.
Yes, and you know, hanging around his neck is sort of like saying all the problems of inflation right now, price inflation and the distortion of the market, it's all Biden's fault. Well, he's a participant, and he aggravates it and makes it worse. All his friends have done that too. But it is very bipartisan. So foreign policy overall has been very bipartisan. Did you hear the Republican Party standing up against us participation in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
No, or the Middle East, or Ukraine, or in any one of these places. They went along with this because the money always gets spent. There's always an emergency like that.
Here we go. Appeals court reinstates hold on Texas immigration law. So I'll try to do it in a nutshell, Dr. Paul. So SB 4 was signed by Greg Abbott, our governor here in Texas, in December. It said that the Texas law enforcement officials can arrest and deport people who are here illegally. Well, a federal court took a hold of that and said, no, you can't do that. We're going to put a stop to that. And then an appeals court said, well, yeah, you can. And so Biden asked the Supreme Court, can you please deal with this in an emergency basis, get rid of the Supreme Court, or get rid of this ability for them to do it? The Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to do it. So we're back at the part where they could do it, and then an appeals court said, actually, you can't do it. So I know that's like your head's turning back and forth like in a cartoon, but where we are right now is it's under appeal, the idea that the state of Texas can protect its own border.
And what they're arguing about is the supremacy clause. You know, Texas says that they're invaders and the federal government's doing nothing. We have a right to protect our state. And they take it to court, and then there is this supremacy clause that I don't want to debate right now, but it to me sounds like it sort of needs to be further defined, because what if you had the supremacy clause and the states were protecting First Amendment rights, but the federal government wasn't? Does that mean we always have to go by the federal government laws? And that's why this problem occurs, because the original intent wasn't that we were going to have a united group of 18 states, 13 states coming together, but all of a sudden it was one country, and then we fought a civil war to prove that you didn't have the right to be independent, and we don't have a republic in that sense. But I think clarification there, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that could deal with it. Maybe we will hear about this, but I just think there are some things that if the our courts are corrupt, our whole our whole system is corrupt. The Justice System Department doesn't even really exist. What do you say? Well, if you have a police problem, you go to the FBI, the CIA, they'll take care of us. So, oh, well, that's the supremacy. They're federal. So there's something about federal that is very annoying, and I think something has been lost when we have lost confidence that our states can handle a lot of these problems.
Here's the funny part, and I underlined it. On Tuesday, Mexico's government declared that it would not accept the return of illegal immigrants from Texas to its territory under any circumstances. Deportations of individuals who are not Mexican citizens are not required to be accepted by Mexico. So even Mexico says, we don't want any illegal aliens, you can't come in. But the U.S. says, come on in.
But this is a narrow argument. They're just arguing about an illegal coming in, and we see them coming in, and it's very precise.
Yeah.
But what about if you go in about 500 miles another state and you have people breaking the law? You're illegal, we can't arrest you. It's crazy.
Those of you who have read Atlas Shrugged will recognize the difference between a businessman such as Hank Rearden, the representative of capitalism, and a businessman such as Orrin Boyle, the typical product of a mixed economy. If you want a historical example, consider the career of James Jerome Hill, who built the Great Northern Railroad without a penny of federal help, who was responsible, practically single-handed, for the development of the entire American Northwest, and who was persecuted by the government all his life under the Sherman Act for allegedly being a monopolist. Consider it, then compare it to the career of the famous California businessman known as the Big Four, who built the Central Pacific Railroad on federal subsidies, causing disastrous consequences and dislocations in the country's economy, then held a 30-year monopoly on railroad transportation in California by means of special privileges granted by the state legislature, which made it legally impossible for any competing railroad to exist in the state. The difference between these two types of business career has never been identified in a generally accepted view of capitalism. By imperceptible degrees, first through the default of capitalism's alleged defenders, then through the deliberate misrepresentations and falsifications of its enemies, the gradual rewriting of our economic history has brought us to the stage where people believe that all the economic evils of the last 2 centuries were caused by the free enterprise element, the so-called private sector of our mixed economy, while the economic progress of these 2 centuries was the result of the government's actions and interventions. People are now told that America's spectacular industrial achievements, unmatched in any period of history or in any part of the globe, were due not to the productive genius of free men, but to the special privileges handed to them by a paternalistic government. The fact that much more autocratic governments with much wider privilege dispensing powers and policies did not achieve the same results anywhere else on earth is blanked out by the proponents of this theory. The only counterpart of this theory's grotesque inversion and monstrous injustice, the only similar method of judgment I can think of, is the mystic's doctrine that man must give credit to God for all his virtues, but must place the blame for all his sins upon himself. Incidentally, the philosophical motive and purpose in both these instances is the same. If you want a contemporary demonstration of the respective value and performance of a free economy and of a controlled economy, a demonstration that comes as close to a historical laboratory experiment as one could hope to see, take a look at the condition of West Germany and of East Germany. No political economic system in history had proved its value so eloquently or had benefited mankind so greatly as capitalism, and none has ever been attacked so savagely and blindly. Why did the majority of the intellectuals turn against capitalism from the start? Why did their victims, the businessmen, bear their attacks in silence? The cause of it is that unchallenged primordial evil, which to this day men are afraid to challenge, the morality of altruism. Altruism has been man's ruling moral code through most of mankind's history. It has had many forms and variations, but its essence has always remained the same. Altruism holds that man has no right to exist for his own sake, that service to others is the only justification of his existence, and that self-sacrifice is his highest moral duty, virtue, and value. The philosophical conflict which, since the Renaissance, has been tearing Western civilization, and which has reached its ultimate climax in our age, is the conflict between capitalism and the altruist morality. Capitalism and altruism are philosophical opposites. They cannot coexist in the same man or in the same society. The moral code, which is implicit in capitalism, had never been formulated explicitly. The basic premise of that code is that man, every man, is an end in himself, not the means to the ends of others, that man must exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others nor sacrificing others to himself, and that men must deal with one another as traders, by voluntary choice to mutual benefit. This, in essence, is the moral premise on which the United States of America was based, the principle of man's right to his own life, to his own liberty, to the pursuit of his own happiness. This is what the philosophers and the intellectuals of the 19th century did not and could not choose to identify, so long as they remained committed to the mystic's morality of altruism. If the good, the virtues, the moral ideal is suffering and self-sacrifice, then by that standard, capitalism had to be damned as evil. Capitalism does not tell men to suffer, but to pursue enjoyment and achievement here on earth. Capitalism does not tell men to serve and sacrifice, but to produce and profit. Capitalism does not preach passivity, humility, resignation, but independence, self-confidence, self-reliance. And, above all, capitalism does not permit anyone to expect or demand, to give or to take the unearned. In all human relationships, private or public, spiritual or material, social or political or economic or moral, capitalism requires that men be guided by a principle which is the opposite of altruism, the principle of justice. Let me stress this, the principle of justice.
So the Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday that the Justice Department is considering whether to offer WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange the opportunity to plead guilty to a reduced charge of mishandling classified information. And this report cited people familiar with the matter. The report said that DOJ officials and Assange's legal team have already had preliminary talks on what a plea deal might look like. However, Barry Pollock, who is a lawyer for Assange, says that he has been given no indication that the department will take a deal. He said in a statement that was released after this story was published by the Wall Street Journal, quote, "It is inappropriate for Mr. Assange's lawyers to comment while his case is before the UK High Court, other than to say we have been given no indication that the Department of Justice intends to resolve the case, and the United States is continuing with as much determination as ever to seek his extradition on all 18 charges, exposing him to 175 years in prison." So Consortium News, Joe Loria over at Consortium News, which isn't an outlet that I trust a lot more than the Wall Street Journal, they reported later in the day that Consortium News had actually previously learned of these talks that happened between the U.S. and Assange's legal team on a potential deal, but the information was given off the record, so they didn't report on it. But in light of this reporting, they said that they actually learned about this as well. So with that, it makes me think that this report is right, although the way that they portray it seems a little sketchy. So this Wall Street Journal report said that if the DOJ offers a deal for Assange to plead guilty to a lesser charge of mishandling classified information, it would be a misdemeanor, and he could potentially enter the plea remotely without going to the U.S. I know that that's a condition for Assange's legal team. They don't want him to go to the U.S. under any circumstances. His time in London's Belmarsh prison, where he's been held since April 2019, would count toward his sentence, and Assange could be free shortly after reaching the deal. Again, this is what the Wall Street Journal is saying. And while a deal like that could potentially secure Assange's freedom, which of course would be great for him and his family, that could still set a dangerous precedent, since it would criminalize the relationship between a journalist and his source. It might be a lesser charge, but he didn't commit a crime. So, that's the whole thing here. And I put in a quote. I just added this before I started recording. I saw Kevin Gosztola. He's a journalist who really focuses on Assange and whistleblower stuff. And he wrote a book on Assange called Guilty of Journalism, the Political Case Against Julian Assange. I wanted to see if he had anything to say about it. So I went over to his Twitter, and he had some interesting stuff to say. He said, basically, U.S. officials chat to the press about some possible plea deal for Assange when he isn't guilty of any crime. If Assange's team signals that it would never be acceptable, then it's Assange's fault that he remains in prison. Officials can say that he wants to martyr himself. And then he goes on to say, it doesn't matter if a plea deal is even on the table or consists of a charge that could legitimately be brought against Assange. The bare fact that Assange won't allow a bad precedent for world press freedom is turned against him by way of making it seem like he's unreasonable. So kind of saying maybe they're leaking this as something that they could use against Assange as part of kind of the propaganda campaign against him. So a group of over 100 Democratic donors sent a letter to President Biden this week warning him that his unconditional support for the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza could cost him the election to former President Trump, who of course is another staunch Israel supporter. So the letter said that likely Biden voters are, quote, now questioning whether the Democratic Party shares their values. If they stay home or vote for a third-party candidate, there is the very real danger that President Biden will be defeated in November, end quote. So the New York Times obtained this letter, and they said that a handful of the signatories had donated six-figure sums to President Biden's 2020 and 2024 campaigns. So these are relatively big donors, showing that the opposition to this is not just among, the average young, progressive-leaning Democratic voter. These are people with some serious money, which means that they have influence in the Democratic Party. So the U.S. is planning to spend $400 million to upgrade an airfield on the island of Yap, which is part of the Federated States of Micronesia. And this was reported by Air and Space Forces magazine. So this is part of the U.S. military's plan to prepare for a war with China. They are working to establish dozens of new airstrips and other types of footholds on small islands across the Asia Pacific. This concept is known by the Air Force as the Agile Combat Employment. In some cases, the U.S. is actually clearing away jungle that has overgrown World War II era runways. And one of those airfields that they're restoring in the northern Marina Islands was where the U.S. Planes that nuked Japan took off from. I know the Enola Gay took off from that airfield to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. And that airfield also served as, I think, the launching point for many of the horrific conventional bombings of Japan and the firebombing of Tokyo and things like that. So the U.S. Air Force laid out its plan to expand an airfield on Yap in its budget request for the 2025 fiscal year. I just put in a Google Map screenshot with a red marker showing where this island is. It's about 1,500 miles southeast of China. And if the project is approved, construction will begin in 2025. So this is just, again, I wanted to highlight this because this is an example of the expansion going on in the region. And this is explicitly to prepare for a war with China. U.S. military leaders have said this is the idea of what they're doing is to create more targets for China to have to hit in a war. That's what General Kenneth Wilsbach, who's the head of Pacific Air Forces, he said that last year. So when I say that they're preparing for war with China, that's exactly what they're saying they're doing as well, which is very, very provocative.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
And it seems like every week, we're talking about the loss of freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom is
like every week. And Gerald, it's a pleasure to be with you, my dear friend, no matter what we're discussing. It seems like every week there's more and more evidence that the Bill of Rights is a bill of government privileges, whereby the government will turn on the spigot of liberty and turn off the spigot of liberty when it wants to. And it's now in its favorite phase, which is turning off the spigot of liberty. And in this case, it's the freedom of speech.
Again, if you don't believe what the government says, then you believe in misinformation. And you have an article here about TikTok, and you said, can Congress ban TikTok? You begin by saying, you can make this quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, First Amendment of the Constitution. When James Madison set about to draft the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, he was articulating what lawyers and philosophers and judges call, quote, negative rights. A positive right grants a privilege, like a driver's license. A negative right restrains the government from interfering with pre-existing right. In order to emphasize his view that the freedom of speech pre-existed the government, Madison insisted that the word "the" precede freedom of speech in the First Amendment. If the freedom of speech preceded the government, where did it come from?
I loved asking that to law students when I was teaching constitutional law, and some would say a consensus of the community, and some would say tradition, which is actually what's taught in many law schools, because they are hard left and they reject the idea that our rights come from our humanity. You don't have to believe in God the Father to accept this. You can recognize that human beings are the highest rational beings on the planet, and we, by our exercise of reason, can discern right from wrong and good from evil. In order to exercise that reason, we have to exercise our free will. And in order to exercise our free will, we have to have the freedom to think as we wish, to say what we think, to read what we want, to publish what we say. It is the third of those that the government is attacking, read what we want, by preventing us from reading and communicating with TikTok.
You know, what you're saying, you know, it's mind-boggling in the sense that have we lost our freedom right in front of everybody's eyes? And all you have to go back to, I mean, how blatant it was with the COVID war. If you don't believe what little clowns are saying, health experts that are little government whores, little bureaucrats, then you have no right to think for yourself. If you don't get that jab, no job. If you're against the vaccination, you believe in misinformation. You don't believe in the drug dealers that morons and imbeciles call Big Pharma. How dare you not believe the drug dealers? They only made how many hundreds of billions of dollars from this thing? Oh, by the way, that we funded to make happen?
You know, it's even worse than that, Gerald. Earlier this week in the Supreme Court, where the issue of whether the government can use a carrot or a stick to influence what big tech is saying, the government actually said to the court, it is necessary for the government to enter the marketplace of ideas in order to stamp out misinformation. Stated differently, the government wants to enter the marketplace of ideas in order to crush those ideas it hates and fears, those ideas which contradict its own orthodoxy. The whole purpose of the First Amendment, the very reason we have a First Amendment, is so that the government won't and can't do that. And here they are telling the court they should be able to do it.
And you use the word the government. A bunch of little freaky clowns in front of everybody's eyes to see. The government. Who, little Lindsey Graham? Chucky Schumer? Mitch McConnell? Biden? Look at the freak show. The government. A bunch of clowns telling us what to do, what to think, and what to believe.
Right.
The government. That's a cover-up. It's a clown show. You know, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, remember when we were kids? It went out of business. You don't have to pay to see the freaks anymore. All you got to do is turn on the TV.
Turn on C-SPAN to see the freak show.
Yeah, there you go.
You know, you have to have a sense of humor in order to get through the day, but there's nothing humorous about the government suppressing speech or attempting to do indirectly what it can't do directly. Indirectly, it is getting the bulletin boards on which we post our ideas, big tech, to advance the speech it likes and suppress the speech it hates, because it can't do it directly. And I'm sorry to tell you, it seems like the court's going to go along with this. Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh gave every indication that they're going to go along with the three liberal members of the court and permit the government to get away with this. This actually started in the Trump administration. I don't know if he personally knew about it, but it's got carried away in the Biden administration. And emails demonstrate this. Emails between the Department of Homeland Security and various general counsels at big tech demanding that certain information be taken down, or demanding that certain information be pushed to the top via their algorithms. This is very, very, very dangerous. If this becomes, if the court allows this to happen, it'll be two major blows to the freedom of speech. One, allowing the government to do indirectly what it can't do directly, and two, taking out of the marketplace of ideas a venue that's used by 150 million people. It's half the country, mainly young people, because the government doesn't like its ideas. What doesn't the government like about its ideas? Well, the government says TikTok spies on you. Oh, really? Who are the biggest spies in the United States of America? Who captures every keystroke on every mobile device and every desktop? The federal government itself. Who told the Supreme Court they have to be able to influence the marketplace of ideas in order to prevent disinformation? The federal government itself. The government is far worse, far more effective, far more destructive of free speech than the owners of TikTok could possibly ever hope to be.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Very clearly not what he was saying. It was just kind of another example of how desperate they are to get him. And it's funny because there's so many easy things to get Donald Trump on, but they still have to try to get him on the most ridiculous shit ever. Like as if he called for a fucking bloodbath, which is not true. He just was saying like, oh, the auto industry will be fucked up if there aren't huge tariffs, which by the way is also retarded as shit. Like the whole argument is dumb as shit. I love how people like, look, the actual economic argument that we should just tax Chinese goods coming into the country and that'll solve our problems is really stupid. Like, think about it like this, all right? This is basically the economic situation in America. China makes all of our stuff for us, and we pay very little for it. And then we turn around and we go, you guys are ripping us off. And they're like, how are we ripping you off? And you're like, well, the way you're doing cheap labor for us is ripping us off. And we should penalize you for working as slave laborers for us, and we should make what you're doing more expensive. And they're like, why would you do that? And they're like, because the stuff we make is more expensive. And they're like, okay, so then basically Americans would only have the option of buying more expensive things. That's how we win, guys. Does that make sense to any of you? That's how we win. By being like, hey, like, why is it that we're buying the Chinese stuff rather than American-made stuff? The answer is because it's way cheaper. Any thoughts, Rob?
There's also something just so ballsy about the claim that they were making when you can see the original footage. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's almost like, I don't know, if you won a fight that someone else picked, and then they went, look, this guy beat this person up in the street. It's like, no, I was attacked, and you can clearly see it. It's so odd that they win. I guess people are in that much of a MSNBC bubble that they're only watching, and they'll never see the original footage to know that that was a complete and flagrant lie. I think the next one is Bernie Sanders working on a 4-day work week for everybody.
That's the answer. The problem with America is we got to work less. Now, what is his argument? That we should have a 4-day work week?
Well, this is what I love about Bernie Sanders is we have inflation, and he's so close to getting it, where he's like, why is it that people are working, they're making more money, and yet they can buy even less, and then we give them more money, and then they still can't buy things? And it's like he's so close to being like, oh, it's inflation, but instead he's like, oh, we need to mandate that they work less hours, which I guess people would make less money, and then there'd be less inflation. I don't really know what but it's like it feels like he's just so close to getting it while missing the picture at the same time.
Yeah, it is funny to be like, okay, like we keep printing all this money, and then the money's worth less. But you know what would solve that is if you were making less money. That would probably fix the whole goddamn thing.
It's almost like they just sat around and they realized, oh, everyone hates the Democrats right now, and he's like, I got this. I'll tell everyone, work even less.
Well, I do understand where that would, like, if I didn't know anything about economics, I do understand, and I was just like working a 9 to 5, I'd be like, I like the guy who says I get another day off. That makes a lot of sense.
You know what is, and he's so Jewish, people are like, I think he understands money. I mean, the most Jewish guy is saying that I can work less, so let's go with that guy.
What he's saying is like, you're getting ripped off by going to work 5 days a week, and we should just let you
What he's
work
really
4
saying
days
is,
a week.
we need to outsource more of the jobs. I mean, really what he's saying, if you're going to make a 30-hour or 35-hour work week and then everything is overtime after that, what you're talking about is more of your jobs going overseas.
100, yeah. See, I kind of get where Bernie Sanders and people who like him like are coming from, and like I could kind of understand. I totally could understand if anyone was going to be like, hey, look, there's these people, like the working man in America is totally getting ripped off, you know, and all these fat cats are getting all these benefits while this guy's getting screwed over. That I'm totally on board with. But if you really believe that, what I don't understand, and where I just stop being able to take you seriously at all, is that isn't your obvious position then that you should end all taxes on middle class people? Because like if you actually give a shit about them and the federal government wants to help them, or there's one really easy way you could help them. Stop stealing all their fucking money. You know what I mean? Like how's that not the first thing? What would let me ask I will ask any like middle class, working class person in America, which would you prefer? A 4-day work week rather than a 5-day work week, or you don't have to pay taxes anymore. You tell me. Let's take a fucking poll on what you like out of those two options better. And I guarantee you, somewhere in the high 90% will vote on just no more taxes. So it's like, it's such a, like, it's a, I don't know, it's like a mind fuck that you live in this world where anyone who represents the federal government could look at you and be like, we're trying to help you out. And you'd be like, okay. It's like somebody who mugs you. And then they come back the next day and they're like, I'm really working on getting you back some of your money. And you just got to just be like, well, I got a great solution. Like, you could just stop doing what you do. And you're like, nah, that's off the table. But like, I got another idea. How about you just don't work so much? And then there won't be so much for me to rob from you.
It's also, I mean, if you just look at the entitlement programs, the fact that I think we're spending another $1 trillion every 100 days, the idea that you're going to reduce the labor of people in the amount that you can tax, and then also be able to cover the entitlement programs with what money? Like, what exactly is the plan at that point? And he goes, well, you'll tax the corporations more. You mean the corporations that you're now forcing to be less profitable because they have to pay the workers overtime? It's like, what exactly is the plan? Of course there is none.
Yeah.
Let's put it up. The Wall Street Journal came out with this yesterday, and it was kind of a surprise to a lot of people. Julian Assange, Justice Department exploring guilty plea to end 14-year legal drama. 14-year legal drama. What was his crime? He was doing journalism. You know, it really does show you what happens when you cross the deep state. You know, they come after you. They released, as soon as they released those CIA documents, that was it. You know, Pompeo plotting to kill him. A real disaster. But let's go to this next one. The Wall Street Journal yesterday said that the U.S. Justice Department is considering whether to allow Julian Assange to plead guilty to a reduced charge of mishandling classified information, according to people familiar with the matter, opening the possibility of a deal that would end a lengthy legal saga triggered by one of the biggest classified intelligence leaks in American history. So this is what you were referring to. And now his attorney, I don't know if I have it on a clip, his attorney said that denied that there was negotiations about this. So we don't know, maybe they're just too sensitive. But the question you bring up is, would you take the plea deal to plead guilty to a reduced charge of mishandling classified information? There are a lot of implications to that.
Yes, and the temptation for a principled person who has a long time suffered to say enough is enough, and others would say, oh no, you know, be crucified and stick to your guns and live with it. But I mentioned to you that with thinking about it, but it's hard to make a decision when you're not the person in it.
Yeah.
But I would be sympathetic, and the analogy I used is, you know, I have voted for an income tax. If you take an income tax, or I described it supporting an income tax, if it's $100 for something on an income tax and they're going to reduce it to $50, I'm going to vote for it because I would see the reduction of the income tax. So if they're going to dramatically reduce the sentence that is illegal and wrong, I think that point has been made, should be made, and continue to be made. But I think it'd be pretty hard, you know, to not take this if this is true.
Yeah.
But there are others that would say, Ron, you're weakening. You should stick to the principle. But I think for me it would be realistic that if I think, because I've had to deal with people and ideas and consequences, that my rule was, are you nudging it toward less government and more freedom? You have to take it, because you can't wait until they deliver to us perfect freedom.
Yeah.
You know, in the broad sense. So this would be a good step for him, I believe. Let's just hope in the next few days we'll find out what's really going on.
Yeah. Our last story for the day is disturbing. I hope it's not true. I fear that it is, and I hope it's not. Put the next one up. This is from Semaphore. This is a new alternative media journal founded by all mainstream media people. So with that said, I would say take it with a grain of salt. But they reported on March 19th, the senators who could fill Trump's national security cabinet. And it immediately caught my attention because it shows Senator Cotton on the cover of the picture accompanying the article. Go to the next clip. This is truly disturbing. Donald Trump is eyeing 3 Republican senators, Bill Hagerty, Tom Cotton, and Marco Rubio, for key national security posts if he wins the White House in November, people close to the Trump campaign told Semaphore. The conservative lawmakers are all prominent hawks on China and Iran and supporters of increased U.S. spending on defense and border security. Trump sees the politicians as potentially partnering with cabinet members and advisors from his first term to create a more unified national security team from day one, the people said. Now, the only thing I would say, to me, this sounds like the neocons are trying to imagine something into place and having it happen. But that said, it could be.
See, you explained the new magazine, Semaphore, but maybe I don't know much about them, but are you sure this is not Onion?
Yeah, I wish it was.
Yeah, it is sad that those names don't affect most Republicans. Most Republicans, oh yeah, we really love that Mike Pompeo and that whole group Cotton they love. And,
yeah.
The authoritarians, the hawks, the ones who spend money and pretend they're economic conservatives, but there's another budget coming up, like they've offered another budget this week, to try to keep from closing down. But these people will be the ones that will vote for this. And yet so this is just a rumor. What they're implying is this is Trump's cabinet, coming up. And if that's the case, we're in big trouble, because that was one of the biggest criticisms that in a way Trump accepted, that he had some poor choices in his first administration, but it doesn't look like this is an improvement.
Yeah, no, on the contrary. In fact, it even gets worse, and you mentioned another name. Go to the next one. Among the first-term confidants that Trump is expected to consider for top jobs, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Pompeo himself is going to go back. John Ratcliffe, one-time congressman who served as Director of National Intelligence, super neocon, and former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Now, he's the guy that kept running interference and prevented our friend Doug McGregor from putting out a plan to get out of Syria and Afghanistan. Super neocon, super hateful guy. They also talk about Fred Fleitz, who's always around town, neocon. And I think, the people that wrote this are well-connected people, and I think they're putting this out because they want the rest of us to look and say, oh, these people have a lot of experience. They're very experienced in foreign policy and national security. But if you look at their experience, everything they've done is wrong.
Unfortunately, my assumption that there's not a whole lot different on the big issues between the two parties.
Yeah.
If they put the same people in and there's a Republican and a Democrat, there's really no change, because it's those people, the truth is, a president, no matter how dedicated he was, he better have a good staff, because there's too much to be personally involved in personally making these decisions, because it's too big. And that's the strongest argument for shrinking government, so you can control it and understand what it is and afford it.
The last thing I would say about this, it's the thing that's so annoying about it is people like Pompeo and little Marco Rubio, they're considered experts. These guys are the experts. Again, as I said, everything they've endorsed has been wrong, has gone terribly badly. They want to go to war with China. We can't even beat the Houthis, right? In Yemen, they want to go to war with China and with Iran. I mean, it's just, they are absolute and utter failures in everything they do. And for Trump to reward them with positions.
Well, there's one position that has been adopted by both parties that I could talk for a long time, but I don't think under the conditions of today we can convert them. And that is the rejection of free trade, which is something that took years to develop and understand, even though the founders understood that. You didn't do those kind of things. But now it's both sides. How are we going to punish sanctions? And then you have these guys running the DOD. One group will come on with the sanctions, and the next group will come on with the bombs.
Yeah, exactly.
And the next group will be coming the draft, because everybody needs foot soldiers.
Yeah.
But one of those days, we're going to go broke and we won't be able to afford it.
Yeah.
So long as the intellectuals of the 19th century held altruism as their moral code, they had to evade the actual nature and meaning of capitalism, and thus come gradually to lose and to betray all of their initial goals and ideals. There were two crucial errors or evasions in the liberals' view of capitalism, from which all the rest of their debacle proceeded. One was their attitude toward the businessman, the other their attitude toward the use of physical force. Since wealth, throughout all the centuries of stagnation preceding the birth of capitalism, had been gained by conquest, by physical force, by political power, the intellectuals took it as their axiom that wealth can be acquired only by force, and refused to break up their mental package deal to differentiate between a businessman and a feudal baron. I quote from my book For the New Intellectual, quote, "Evading the difference between production and looting, they called the businessman a robber. Evading the difference between freedom and compulsion, they called him a slave driver. Evading the difference between reward and terror, they called him an exploiter. Evading the difference between paychecks and guns, they called him an autocrat. Evading the difference between trade and force, they called him a tyrant. The most crucial issue they had to evade was the difference between the earned and the unearned." Close quote. The intellectuals refuse to identify the fact that the source of industrial wealth is man's mind, that the fortunes made in a free economy are the product of intelligence, of ability. This led them to the modern version of the ancient soul-body dichotomy, to the contradiction of upholding the freedom of the mind while denying it to the most active exponents of creative intelligence, the businessmen, the contradiction of promising to liberate man's mind by enslaving his body. It led them to regard the businessman as a vulgar materialist, or a brute, or a babbit, as some sort of inferior species born to serve them, and to regard themselves as some sort of elite born to rule him, to control his life and dispose of his product. The shabby monument to this premise was the idea of divorcing production from distribution, of assuming the right to distribute that which one has not produced. The only way to implement an idea of that kind, the next step in their moral descent, was the intellectual's alliance with the thug, with the advocate of rule by brute force, the totalitarian collectivist. The intellectual's second error, their attitude toward the use of force, is a corollary of the first. So long as they refuse to identify the nature of free trade and of a social system based on voluntary, uncoerced, unforced, non-sacrificial relationships among men, so long as the moral cannibalism of the altruist code permitted them to believe that it is virtuous and right to sacrifice some men for the sake of others, the intellectuals had to embrace the political creed of collectivism, the dream of establishing a perfect altruist society at the point of a gun. They projected a society where all would be sacrificed to that conveniently undefinable idol, the public good, with themselves in the role of judges of what that good might be and of who would be the public at any given moment. An ideal society to be achieved by means of physical force, that is, by means of the political power of the state, by means of a totalitarian dictatorship. The rest is history. The shameful, sordid, ugly history of the intellectual development of the last 150 years. In the realm of political theory, the switch from the liberalism of the 19th century to the collectivism of the 20s was accomplished when people began to accept the Marxist view of the nature of government, the view that a government is and has to be the agent of the economic interests of some class or another, and that the sole political issue is which class will seize control of the government to force its own interests on all other groups or classes. Thus, capitalism came to be regarded as an economic system in which government coercion is used for the benefit of the businessmen, the employers, or the rich in general. This serves as a justification for the liberals, the socialists, or any other collectivists when they propose to use government coercion for the benefit of the workers, the employees, or the poor in general. And thus the existence, the possibility, the historical record, and even the theory of a non-coercive society are wiped out of people's minds and out of public discussion. In the early years of American capitalism, the government's intervention into the country's economy was minimal. The government's role was predominantly confined to its proper function, that of a policeman and arbiter charged with the task of protecting the individual citizen's rights and property. The most notorious exception to that rule existed only in the agrarian, non-industrial, non-capitalist states of the South, where the state governments upheld the institution of slavery. The attempts to obtain special economic privileges from the government were begun by businessmen, not by workers, but by businessmen who shared the intellectual's view of the state as an instrument of positive power serving the public good, and who invoked it to claim that the public good demanded canals or railroads or subsidies or protective tariffs. It is not the great industrialists of America, not men like J.J. Hill, who ran to government for special favors, but random adventurers with political pull, or, later, those pretentious types indoctrinated by the intellectuals who dreamed of statism as a, quote, manifest destiny, close quote. It was not the businessmen, or the industrialists, or the workers, or the labor unions that began the revolt against freedom, the demand for greater and greater government power, and ultimately for the return to an absolute totalitarian state. It was the intellectuals. For a detailed history of the steps by which the intellectuals of Germany led it toward totalitarianism, culminating in the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship, I will refer you to a brilliant book entitled Omnipotent Government by Professor Ludwig von Mises. For a detailed history of the intellectuals' role in America, I will refer you to The Decline of American Liberalism by Professor Arthur A. Eckert, Jr., which I mentioned earlier.
So Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer has vowed that Israel will invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah, even if it causes a rift with the United States. So any Israeli attack on Rafah, of course, would incur a huge civilian casualties, since there's 1.5 million people packed into the city, many displaced from elsewhere in Gaza. You know, think about the number of people that are there who were in Gaza City, had to evacuate there, went south, had to evacuate. There's people that have had to move multiple times. And most of the Palestinians in Gaza are packed into Rafah. 1.5 million people. The population is about 2.3 million. So the Israelis are saying that they're going to go ahead with this anyway. They claim that they have a plan to protect civilians or evacuate civilians, but the U.S. has actually said Israel has not presented any plan. So Dermer, who he is a former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., and he was actually born in the U.S., so he's American, he said, quote, "We're quite confident that we can do this in a way that would be effective, not only militarily, but also on the humanitarian side. And they have less confidence that we can do it. It will happen even if Israel is forced to fight alone. Even if the entire world turns on Israel, including the United States, we're going to fight until the battle is won," end quote. So, of course, Netanyahu has repeatedly vowed that he will go ahead with the invasion of the city, despite concerns from President Biden. But I don't know if he said anything explicitly as this, saying, even if we're alone without the United States, we're going to go in. This article is from Middle East Eye. And this is based on something reported by a journalist for Israel's Khan News. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but I figured it was worth running this because he is suggesting that the new U.S. built, or which is in the process of being built, this makeshift port off Gaza that Biden has ordered to be created by the U.S. military, he suggested that it could be used to deport Palestinians. And this is, again, according to a journalist in Khan News, that he said this at a private meeting of the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Security Committee. And again, I haven't seen this anywhere else, but this is something that a lot of people are suspecting that's what he wants out of this pier, that could be part of the plan. Because this, if you remember, there was that report recently that said this was actually all Netanyahu's idea. He floated it back in October, the idea of building a temporary pier. And I think part of the strategy here is them putting as much pressure, starving people, making the place uninhabitable. So eventually, I think they're hoping that the U.S., Egypt, or whoever else says, all right, fine, let's get them out of there. I think that might be part of the thinking here. And so that's what, the U.S. military has deployed to build right off the coast of Gaza. And just the whole idea of it is completely insane. I mean, putting U.S. troops, they're saying that they're not going to go on the ground, but if they're right off the coast, you got to figure Hamas or anybody, a lot of other people in Gaza are, have plenty of motive to try to hit some U.S. troops. And if that happens, I mean, who knows? Imagine the hysteria from Congress. Imagine what they're going to want the U.S. to do if some American troops get killed by Hamas or by a rocket that's fired out of Gaza. Just a mess. So Reuters reported on Thursday that some Western banks are lobbying against an EU plan to use profits made by Russian central bank funds that are frozen in Europe to arm Ukraine. So the European Commission has proposed sending up to 3 billion euros to Ukraine per year using this revenue. And again, this is frozen Russian funds, like the interest and stuff that it's making while sitting in the European banks where it's frozen. So they're talking about giving that interest to Ukraine. And Russia, of course, has criticized this plan and say that they will respond. Maria Zakharova, the Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman, she said on Wednesday, quote, "This is outright banditry and theft. These actions are a gross and unprecedented violation of basic international norms. We said we would respond, and so we shall," end quote. And so these banks they're basically lobbying for the EU not to do this because they're worried that if they're involved in the transactions, it will open them up to legal action, especially in the future eventually you figure these sanctions on Russia will be lifted or eased, and then Russia's going to try to get their money. And so it's going to be a lengthy, they're warning that it could be a legal battle that lasts decades. And they're also warning that it would erode trust in the Western banking system, saying that stealing these funds would amount to the weaponization of foreign-held reserves and assets. And the U.S. is looking to take an even more extreme measure. The U.S. wants to give all the Russian funds to Ukraine, not just the money made on the interest, all of it. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen came out very strongly in favor of this idea last month. And now there is legislation that's been introduced in Congress that has a lot of co-sponsors, hasn't been voted on yet, but this is something that I wouldn't be surprised if we see the U.S. do. So about $300 billion in Russian central bank funds are frozen in the U.S., the EU, Japan. I think there might be some in Canada. Most of it's in Europe, over $200 billion. And the U.S. has $67 billion. And that's around the number that Biden's trying to get authorized for Ukraine. He's trying to get another $61 billion. So they're thinking about just taking this money to send to Ukraine. And it's something I know that Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, has said he favors, but it would be an unprecedented step. The U.S. freezes stuff all the time, although they do steal Iranian oil and sell it off. But this is a little more extreme just because of the sheer numbers that we're talking about here.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
This is great. This was an article from Reuters. You ready? U.S. IRS chief, Internal Revenue Service, sees workforce topping 100,000 within 3 years. Isn't that great? So they can steal more money from us to give to their military-industrial complex and all their friends. Yeah. So, again, we make sure that every penny that we have is clear because we know they'll come after somebody like me. February home sales spiked 9.5%, the largest monthly gain in a year. Again, when interest rates went up and everybody said in the mainstream media that home prices would go down, we said, no way, no how. They're going to keep going up. Matter of fact, I just bought another one, another piece of real estate. Most of the people aren't going to be able to afford it, but when you have a country of 332 million people, you got a lot of people within that number that could keep buying stuff. Stretched U.S. shoppers start to hold back on spending. This is from the Financial Times yesterday. Retail sales increased 0.6% in February from the previous month, missing expectations of 0.8. The increase reversed a 1.1% decline from December to January. Oh, no, I thought they told us that they increased. Yeah, they're rigging the numbers. The numbers are going down. We're just nothing more than plantation workers of Slavelandia. Gucci owner Kering tanks 14% after Asia profit warning, dragging down Europe luxury brands. Old news for Trends Journal subscribers. We've been writing about this for months and months and months and months. Go back to Asia. Thank China. Launched the COVID war on January 2020, in celebration of their Chinese Lunar New Year, the year of the rat, and locked down the joint for 3 years with their zero COVID policy. The economy boomed when they were brought into the World Trade Organization in 2 weeks after 9/11, when people weren't paying attention. Whew, they overbuilt like any boom. So the real estate boom was about to bust anyway, but this made a very bad situation worse. That's why you're seeing the luxury sales go down, because the Chinese were traveling all over the world, buying up stuff like crazy, ain't doing it no more. It's very important to see the luxury brands. You know why? Because you can see how the economy goes down. You know, the fish rots from the head down. Gabish. So the top is rotten. Austin commends allies for support of Ukraine. He said Ukraine's battle remains one of the great causes of our time. Hey, Austin, you know what?
Bullshit.
You're full of
bullshit.
Austin just speaks
Bullshit.
What do you mean the greatest cause of our time? This fucking stuff been going on between Russia and Ukraine for what? Since Catherine the Great? Not my concern. I'm an American. I'm concerned about the people flooding into this country, the IRS with 100,000 people, the streets filled with homeless, migrants, crime rising, taxes going up. That's what I'm concerned about. Fuck you, Salenti. You're not a warmonger. We hate you because you launched Occupy Peace. Oh, but over a decade ago. The United States would face grave new perils in a world where aggression and autocracy are on the march, and where tyrants are emboldened, and when dictators think they can wipe democracy off the map. Oh, you mean you're talking about Israel? Is that what oh, no, I forgot. You're talking about Russia. Today's Ukrainian survival is a danger, and American security is at risk. Total fucking absolute bullshit. Where are the people? World War III's begun. Get it in your head. French army ready for war, top general. All right? French General Pierre Schill. Yeah, real fucking shill. Said, told Le Monde, whatever the developments in the international situation, the French can be convinced their soldiers will respond. He said it's an internet. Hey, soldiers will respond. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hey, fuckface. Like you said, Napoleon sent 420,000 to attack Moscow in 1812 and came back with 10,000. Oh, those soldiers, I forgot. Poor guys died for nothing. Goes on. President Macron, goes on. More war. Western troops in Ukraine, an open secret. That's that guy, Polish Foreign Minister Sikorsky says this. That in an interview with DPA on Wednesday, Sikorsky stated, as your chancellor, speaking in Germany, Olaf Scholz said, there are already some troops from big countries in Ukraine. All right? German aid to boost Kyiv's artillery stocks. $500 million. Keeps going on and on and on. EU leaders urge to put economies on war footing as Ukraine negotiations falter. This is from The Guardian. On Thursday, prime ministers, they're meeting a sense of urgency and immediacy, expected to examine contentious plans to confiscate billions of euros from Russia. Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, said, quote, now that we are facing the biggest security threat since the Second World War, this is such fucking bullshit. It is high time we take radical and concrete steps to be defense ready and put the EU's economy on a war footing. Isn't that great? Germany's in a recession. People are having a very difficult time, but more money for the military-industrial complex. When all else fails, they take you to war.
Live from Run Your Mouth World Headquarters. It's today's Run Your Mouth
Kilo. All right, next up, this is from Mish Talk. Green wave in reverse, Biden rolls back EV mandates, but not enough. This is one of those stories that we love to cover here of how many times people are sitting down, they're trying to make business decisions, and then new government policy comes around that entirely ruins their plans. So, for example, you think government's going to force you to switch to all electric vehicles, and so you make switches to plants that are less profitable. You train people in processes that are different than the actual cars. You don't invest in the research and development of gas engines, and then all of a sudden government realizes, oh, they can't enforce all these mandates, and so you actually have more time. And I'm just saying, how do you even do the calculation of how much gets lost in the process of thinking you have to do something or you're going to be in trouble with government, and then realizing, oh, we can change course? Just think about how much economic growth gets lost every single year as people are just trying to make decisions about what will government let me do, as opposed to what would be the best products and services for my customers, as opposed to sitting around and thinking, how do I create more value? How do I create a better experience? How do I make a better product? How do I get this to market? Instead of sitting down and having all those meetings, instead, everyone's just sitting around trying to figure out government instead, and just think about how much wasted brain power and just how much time is wasted when you spend an entire year drumming up specific plans thinking that there's a regulation that's coming, and it just doesn't come. Now, what was fascinating about this article is that they're talking about in California, there's already massive increases in everybody's electricity bills. And you guys can go check out the article. It's kind of technical, but it also talks about what is that going to look like if California actually goes to 100% electric vehicles? What's going to actually happen to everyone's electric bills? And then what's going to be the plan when poor people can't run their air conditioners in the summer? Or what are you going to do when people's refrigerators cost 4 times more to run? What is the plan? If people are already pissed off about 13% increases in their electric bill, what's going to happen when suddenly all cars are mandated to be electric and you haven't updated the electricity grid to be ready for that? Now, the other part that makes this interesting is that they were pitching that it's actually becomes cheaper, I guess, on a weekly basis to fill your tank, because you don't actually have to fill your tank. I'm saying like the amount that you're spending per charge to get a certain amount of miles. And on some cars, the math on that has already changed because general electricity prices are up. Well, what's that going to look like when everyone's forced to be in an electric vehicle? And so what this points to is exactly what we experienced with COVID, where we were sitting around and we're like, wait, everyone's just not going to work, and that's going to be better? Or what about everyone that's miserable because they're not working? What about suicide rates? What about alcoholism? What about kids not being in school? What about the entire way the natural immunity thing works? And if everyone just goes out there and they get sick, then we can move on with it. And wait, why do you tell me that this new vaccine is actually better? Remember all those little thoughts that we were having when you were just looking at the government policy and they're like, well, you can't ask those questions? That's socialism across the board. And it's the same thing with the electric vehicles. And them just going, we need everyone to be on board on the movement to electric. Well, can the grid even handle that? What will the cost look like if they don't ask those questions? We just need everybody on board. And it's funny because we're only in, I guess, the first couple of years of them trying to make these changes, and it's already falling apart on them. This is a worthwhile watch because you get to see how I bet we could even take the government scientists and they would fold under this questioning. And if you ever need to be persuasive, Kennedy's got some good tricks with just the how questions, or can you define that? Can you tell me what the alternative would be? Just really simple questions where when people do know absolutely nothing about what they're talking about, they fold pretty quickly. Let's give it a watch, and that will be our episode. Here we go.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Vice Chairman. Mr. Schumacher, welcome. You were, who invited you here today?
I came with Protect Our Winters.
Right. But you're here on behalf of the Democrats or the Republicans?
I'm here on behalf of the outdoor enthusiasts around America.
Okay. You were contacted.
I'm here for the trees.
By Senator Whitehouse's staff.
I personally came with Protect Our Winters, so I don't know how that went.
Okay.
Exactly.
What is carbon dioxide?
I went to high school, but that's carbon dioxide is a gas.
Yo, bro, I just like ski a bunch. I don't know about all that stuff.
Okay.
I'm not a professional to talk about carbon dioxide so much, but
well, you want us to abolish it, right?
No, there's always going to be carbon dioxide.
Right. So what is it you want us to do?
Let
me back up because I want to. I mean, you're here as an expert. Tell me more about what carbon dioxide is.
I'm here as an expert cross-country skier who sees the changes in my winters and the landscape that I live in Alaska. And so carbon dioxide is
changes in your winters. What are you, 18? Or what is this kid, 22? So let's just say since 18, he's been observing it. I ski 2 days a year every single season. And let me tell you something, it's different every single year. There's no pattern to it. If I'm trying to ski in the Northeast, I mean, if anything, I've started to notice ski later because there seems to be more snow later. I don't know why that is. It used to be December was a better month. I guess I've noticed that one singular pattern. But believe me, there's plenty of mountains with snow and there's different snowfall every single season. But what exactly was your documentation process that you're like, yeah, there's like a little bit less powder this year? All right, let's continue. I don't need to be even asked these questions. Kennedy's got it.
What I see it as is, it's a gas that exists in our atmosphere. And
what, is it the major part of our atmosphere? Or?
It's a huge part of our atmosphere, yeah.
It's actually a very small part of our atmosphere.
Well, okay. But, yeah, I don't know. What are you asking specifically?
Well, you said we need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. I'd like to know first if you know what it is. You want us to abolish fossil fuels?
I never said that.
You never have said that?
No.
Okay. What do you think we ought to do with fossil fuels?
What will we do with fossil fuels?
Yeah. Should we make any changes?
I would like to see a decrease in the use of fossil fuels. I think there's a possibility to use more electric generation.
Okay. Over what period of time? 10 years, 50 years, 100 years?
I would like to see it come as fast as possible while continuing.
How fast?
Sorry?
How fast?
I don't have a good answer for that. No.
Okay. You just think, well,
let me tell you, this was me the couple times I actually went on a real finance interview and they're like, hey, can you do this math riddle? I'm like, no, but this is absolutely just getting caught with their pants down. I can't even believe this kid showed up for this.
All right, so everybody knows that the national defense budget is only $800 and something billion a year. So what's with this crazy headline of yours here?
Well, that they're very careful to. I mean, the number is still obscenely large, but they're sort of careful to leave out all sorts of very relevant national security activities. And as we try to point out, that the real number, if you count in, everything that your dollar and taxpayer dollar and mine goes for the cause of national security, we're heading towards 2 trillion. I mean, we're in 1 trillion point 767 right now and rising sharply.
Amazing. So help walk us through this. How do we get from 800 billion to almost another trillion on top of that?
Well, the problem is that they, as I say, they leave out a lot of stuff. Things like the amount we spend on nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, the bombs, the newer bombs, the bigger bombs, the smaller bombs, and that funneled through the Department of Energy. And that comes to $37 billion, not a small sum. Then there's like 26 billion for military pensions and healthcare, which is, again, if we, very obviously very pertinently part of it. Another 12 billion for the selective service operation. And then, as Winslow Wheeler points out, there's something very mysterious. There's a suspicious-looking category for the international activities of the FBI, which they refuse to tell us what that is. It's just lumped under defense-related activities. So, and then going on down the list, there's a huge chunk for the money we pay to, the interest on the debt for the money, the debt that we borrowed, the money we borrowed to finance all this in the first place. So that comes to $254 billion. So once you start adding it all up, as I say, we're heading for $2 trillion.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then, of course, there's also, as you guys talk about in the piece here, you and Winslow Wheeler, you have this kind of separate war budget. So if we give billions of dollars to Israel, to Ukraine, to Taiwan, to whoever, that doesn't get counted in the original defense budget, right?
Right. That's where they've announced this budget. And then what's going to happen is they'll tack on things as needs be for Israel, for Ukraine, for Taiwan, for something called the Defense Industrial Base, which is a lot of money handed out to corporations to build plants, to step up production facilities for artillery shells or whatever. Yeah. So they've been able to present this year. They say, oh, look, we're spending less this year. We're projected to spend less, actually, for next year, which is the budget we're talking about, than we did this year. But that's just sleight of hand, because by the time they've tossed in all these other ingredients, it'll be higher.
Yeah.
So, essentially, this is you really have to realign your sort of political classifications. Like at the State of the Union, Congressman Thomas Massey, he had Julian Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, sitting beside him, as an honored guest. I didn't see much coverage of that given in the reports on the speech, but it was a noble effort. Actually, there's quite a few. There is a little sort of congressional movement, I don't know if you can call it a caucus, protesting at the treatment of Assange, which is bipartisan. You have like Massey, who's considered normally, or is a conservative Republican, Ray McGovern, who's a liberal Democrat. So there are a few honorable figures who, see this for what it is, but, they're very much in the minority.
Yeah, man, it's really too bad. And, because of partisanship, it's so hard to build the real consensus of, of the American people that we just absolutely won't tolerate this. Maybe we will, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's being shredded. The control, obviously, what happened, there's been a concerted effort. The internet sort of got out of control for a while, and there were all sorts of things, information freely available to people, which caused people to, go in directions that the establishment didn't care for. And there's been this concerted effort to bring the social media, which I guess they're worried about, but the internet, bring social media under control, and the whole, that's what the Twitter files revealed. I mean, thank goodness Mr. Musk, for a brief moment at least, was prepared to, for whatever reason, to let that happen, release what Twitter had been doing in terms of cooperating with the government, with the FBI, to suppress free speech. But I have the worst forebodings, especially this horrifying statement by the, beloved liberal Justice Ketanji Brown, saying, the government being hamstrung by the First Amendment. Isn't that that whirring sound must be Thomas Jefferson or James Madison whirring in their graves. But
seriously,
that's where we are.
Yeah, it's just amazing that she could even utter something like that out of her own mouth and not think, oh, what the hell am I saying? That's what the First Amendment. How about, am I allowed to choose my church? Are you going to figure that out for me too, lady, huh?
Oh, yeah, yeah, right, yeah, exactly.
Oh, if the First Amendment doesn't mean what it says, then I guess they can just outlaw, I don't know, Presbyterians. I hear they're pretty soft on supporting Israel.
Oh yeah, they better watch out. They'll be in the lineup. Yeah, there's even a few Baptists around the place who maybe might be considered undependendable. Yeah,
Can't have that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really feel like we're being boiled like frogs. It's,
Yep.
The Peter Schiff Show.
The press conference, I thought, was another very dovish conference by Powell. And the markets agreed because the Dow Jones and the S&P rallied to record highs. In fact, the Dow closed up better than 400 points. We're above 39,500. So we're almost going to hit 40,000 on the Dow. We'll probably be there pretty soon, given the green light that Powell gave to the speculators to go out and buy risk assets. Now, not just risk assets, safe haven assets. Gold rose about $30 during the U.S. session. GLD, which is the U.S. ETF, closed at a record high close. It didn't have a record high intraday, but the close was a record high. Now, already this evening, gold added another $15 to that run, hitting a new all-time record high. Gold traded above $2,200 an ounce for the first time ever, and silver had an even stronger day than gold. As I've been saying on this podcast, silver is the real buy. I mean, gold's a good buy too, but silver's an even better buy, and it's now almost $26 an ounce. But it's got a long way to go, and I think both gold and silver are going to rise. The dollar fell on the news; it didn't fall enough. I think it's going to fall a lot more. Commodities in general, I posted again. Just look at it, the chart for the CRB. This thing is going to rip. I mean, this is a beautiful looking chart. Commodity prices, oil was down today. That's because it had got up to 83 and it pulled back and it's about 81.65. But copper jumped up big again today, not as much as silver, but it was a good move. But I think we're on the verge of the biggest bull market in commodities since the 1970s. Of course, this flies in the face with Powell claiming that inflation is going to go back down to 2%. There's no chance that inflation is going to go back down to 2%. All the data shows that inflation is on the way up. Plus, if you understand what inflation is, it's got nowhere to go but up. And that, I think, is why the markets reacted the way they did, because Powell basically dismissed the bad inflation news that came out for January and February. I mean, he kind of said, well, it's due to seasonal effects. Well, it's already adjusted for that. So it's like you can't say it's seasonal when the numbers are already seasonally adjusted. It's like saying it's transitory, which basically is what he said. So he dismissed it. And the Fed is still saying that we're going to get 3 rate cuts this year. But in addition to that, the even more dovish than that was the admission by Powell that they're going to begin shortly in reducing the size of their asset sales, quantitative tightening. They're going to pare it back. So they're going to start shrinking the balance sheet more slowly. Now, I've been saying the Fed is going to go back to quantitative easing. This is just the first step in that process. First thing they do is less QT, and then the next thing, they're back to QE. The February budget deficit came out, and the government reported almost a 13% increase in the deficit from the prior year. And in fact, the deficit in February was the biggest deficit in any February in history, with the sole exception of February of 2021. Now, what was going on in February of 2021? The COVID stimulus checks. And so outside of this crazy year of COVID, we just had the biggest February deficit in our history, and we're supposedly in a booming economy. Everybody who talks about the economy talks about how strong it is. I was listening to Jeremy Siegel, was on CNBC today, talking about our booming economy, our strong economy, and everybody agrees we've got this really strong economy. Well, why do we have record high deficits? If the economy is so strong, where are all the tax revenues that this strong economy is supposed to be generating? Why are so many people getting government checks? And also, the amount of money the government spent in February of 2024 is 50% more than it spent in February of 2020, which was right before COVID started. So that was the last normal year, right before we went off into the twilight zone. But government spending is up 50% from where it was 4 years ago, and there's no emergency anymore. We have supposedly record low unemployment. How is that possible? Where is the government getting all this money to spend 50% more than it spent 4 years ago? This is why we have inflation. It's driving prices higher. All this money is being spent. How can it not bid up prices? And this is why the Fed is not only going to taper the QE program, the QT program, but go back to quantitative easing, because government spending is going ballistic. And all of it is stoking the fires for inflation. You know, Powell said in his prepared remarks right off the bat that the Fed's interest rate policy has been putting downward pressure on inflation. No, it hasn't. There's no downward pressure from 5.25%, 5.5% interest rates. Those rates are still too low. They've done nothing to stop runaway government borrowing and spending, and nothing to stop runaway consumer borrowing and spending.
But many friends of liberty, generally supporters of the right to keep and bear arms, the Second Amendment, they've fallen into a trap. And what they're doing, by accident possibly, is they're using a pro-gun grabber view of the right to keep and bear arms, that it doesn't exist as an individual right, but instead only as a collective right and only for the National Guard. And they're using that same framework to tell us the Defend the Guard Act has a fatal flaw. Hopefully this is going to make some sense here. First, to Mike Meharry, he points out that Defend the Guard is a state-level bill that would stop the deployment of a state's National Guard units unless specific constitutional criteria are met. It would prohibit deployment to active duty combat unless Congress has passed a declaration of war or taken official action pursuant to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution to explicitly call forth the Guard for one of three enumerated purposes: to execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections, to repel invasions. Those of you who have read the Constitution and do so regularly, which I do encourage, will recognize this language coming from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution, which says the Congress shall have power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And also Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16. These are the militia clauses. Congress shall have power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Now, I think much of this really comes from Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, his plan for the militia, which he sent to George Washington in early 1790, and part of it says this: an energetic national militia is to be regarded as the capital security of a free republic and not a standing army forming a distinct class in the community. Now, finally, we're going to get to it. Here's where the gun grabber argument comes in. Of course, we know there are people who absolutely hate the natural right of self-defense. They hate the right to keep and bear arms, and they want to twist the meaning of the Second Amendment. They want us to believe that it has nothing to do with an individual right to keep and bear arms. Well, it really has. It's a restriction on government to not infringe on the natural right of self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms of individuals. They want us to believe that it is only a collective right. It can only be exercised by people who are in the militia, and the people to them who are in the militia are just the National Guard. So there are people, and there are a growing number of people in the gun grabbing community who want to push things forward to say that unless you are signed up for the Guard, you have zero right to keep and bear arms, unless they just decide to give you permission. So it'll be up to them. Patrick Henry first. Here he is in the Virginia Ratifying Convention telling us that the great object is that every man be armed. So he was very concerned about these militia clauses, because when he read them, he was warning. He's like, well, what if Congress doesn't arm everybody? Then we're going to run into a problem. We should be able to take responsibility for arming ourselves here in Virginia, for example. He said, when this power is given up to Congress without limitation or bounds, how will your militia be armed? You trust to chance. For sure I am that the nation which shall trust its liberties in other hands cannot long exist. So he warned that if you pass these militia clauses in 15 and 16 in Article 1, Section 8, then you are relying on Congress doing the right thing. It doesn't require them to arm the entire body of the people. It doesn't require them to fulfill this great object that every man be armed. It just gives them the power to decide to or not. And Patrick Henry did not like that. He was concerned that this would actually, if you think about it, and we'll get a little from Luther Martin on this in just a moment, but if you think about it, if they don't arm everybody, if the population at large is not armed, they're going to be more reliant on professionals, the standing army, the bane of liberty. Anyways, now, if you think about this argument, the Second Amendment does not say a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the militia to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. No, it says the right of the people. So instead of rejecting this argument that the Second Amendment, or the right to keep and bear arms, only applies to members of the active duty militia, the National Guard, instead of rejecting this as totally absurd, These so-called supporters, or I'm sure the intention is good, but they're really playing defense, and they tacitly accept part of the gun-grabbing argument. If the National Guard is the militia, the entirety of the militia, instead of just the organized part of it, and the right to keep and bear arms can only be restricted to the Guard, then of course, instead of just saying your argument is dumb and wrong, they're saying, well then the National Guard isn't the militia. The right to keep and bear arms only applies to the militia. They're actually accepting that view. Now, Anti-Federalists repeatedly warned that the militia clauses would be used basically the way that we're seeing them used, to decimate the militia, the general population, the people, the whole people, as George Mason put it, in favor of a standing army, the bane of liberty. And here's how Luther Martin put it in January of 1788. He said, when a government wishes to deprive their citizens of freedom and reduce them to slavery, it generally makes use of a standing army for that purpose and leaves the militia in a situation as contemptible as possible, lest they might oppose its arbitrary designs. He was very concerned that the bulwark of liberty, the militia, the armed people of each state, would be decimated by these clauses in the Constitution. He said, in this system, we give the general government every provision it could wish for, and even invite it to subvert the liberties of the states and their citizens, since we give them the right to increase and keep up a standing army as numerous as it would wish, and by placing the militia under its power, enable it to leave the militia totally unorganized, undisciplined, and even to disarm them. And ultimately, this is the kind of system that we have today. They've disregarded this goal that every person be armed, instead creating this professional kind of elite type of a force that George Mason warned about. And therefore, it encourages more of a standing army because, as James Madison told us, the best defense against calls for a large permanent standing army is to have a strong, powerful militia so you don't have to call on that professional force all the time.
Headline here is, quote, invasion, which it is. It's an invasion. And I think they should have used that from the beginning. The first time I got involved in using that word was in 1987. I was a candidate, to run in the Libertarian Party, and they were not totally sold on me being the candidate, and they thought I might be just conservative and that sort of thing. But they came up on immigration, and they didn't think I had a strong enough position. I said, I have a problem with it. I did argue and say, I know all the answers. I said, I have a problem with it. What happens when this immigration turns into an invasion? And it was hints of what was happening. And with our system of justice and welfare, it is. And more people, it's commonly used now, invasion, and that's the correct term to use. Now, this article on Zero Hedge says, invasion, riot erupts after migrants swarm breaches in U.S. southern border. National Guard left helpless. That tells you so much going on and where we are. And the National Guard, and then Texas tried to pass a law to clarify and say, we have the right to defend our state. And of course, it's in the courts, it's back and forth, there's been some stays, and they're arguing, and I guess eventually the Supreme Court has to settle this. Does a state have the right to stop the invasion, which is an invasion, come in and using up the facilities and getting in people's houses and going into schools and hospitals and all. If they don't have the right to do something about this, then we're in a big problem. But we've been in a big problem, and the Department of Justice is the case. Just think of in the last several years getting involved in the political things where the Department of Justice is controlled sometimes by our social media, and the social media will tell who to ban, who to cancel, and it's a collusion. So that's, people throw the word fascist around carelessly, but at least we're talking about is corporatism, where the corporations, whether it's pharmaceuticals or whether it's a military-industrial complex, the collusion of big business and big government is very, very powerful, and they deserve the term to be used maybe cautiously. Is this fascism? Well, certainly leaning toward fascism. It's been predicted by Mises that if we continue to have the system we have now of corporatism, it does evolve into fascism, and that becomes much more militant and authoritarian. But that is the big problem that we have, and that is the reason why people have to wake up to this. So I think that the people now are sick and tired of this. And the whole idea, what is the position of the states? I'll tell you what, I would predict to say if somebody did deep research at the founding of this country, I'll bet you the states would have been, very rebellious against what was going on if they said, oh yeah, we're going to join, and you guys can come in here from the Washington and dictate to us how to keep peace and order. They wouldn't even have signed up, I believe. But it's going to continue until we look at this on a basic principle of what the states are allowed to do. I think the states right now are just pushed around overly so from the federal government. But what are you going to do if the federal government is corrupt? We have a problem there. It's a philosophic about a basic understanding of what real liberty means to all of us.
We see throughout history there's a common human error that keeps repeating itself. We're living through it right now. And that's the idea that if you destroy everything, then you'll be able to build back your utopia on the ashes. This goes back to the Soviets, to the French Revolution. This keeps repeating itself, where people, they don't like what they see, so they figure, let's just destroy everything, and then we'll start over and build back better. Society is not built that way. It's not built from the top down. It's not built at all. It's not a bunch of dudes sitting around a table with a blueprint and they're going to implement their plans. Society flourishes first from moral principles. There has to be a common morality among the people first. That has to be adopted, because if you don't have that, then the rest doesn't matter. Private property, sound money, voluntary interactions, none of that happens if you first don't have that moral principle. Western civilization had a common moral principle. It was called Christianity. Our country, same thing. That was the foundation, and then everything else. Private property. I won't hurt you, you don't hurt me. This is mine, this is yours. Let's come together and exchange voluntarily. Let's have sound money. Well, the destroyers look at this and they want to destroy it. So the first thing you do is you abandon all morality. All of it has to go. And then you start destroying. Private property is gone. Sound money is gone. Equality under the law is gone. It all just gets peeled away. And they do destroy. The Soviets destroyed. All the communists around the world and all those, they definitely destroyed. But guess what? It stays destroyed. They build absolutely nothing on top of the ashes. What has to happen is the people say, these people are nuts. We need to start over with a moral foundation, and then you start building there. This is what's happening to our country. Our morality has been flushed down the toilet, and everything else has followed. So we need to turn around first by respecting each other, our property, and then going from there.
Very good. People do know what's right and wrong, but they would like to blacken their minds out, and they are indoctrinated to think, well, if people have something else, I have a right to take it from them. Oh, that's not stealing, and they become nihilists. They don't believe telling lies make a difference, and that's the type of system that we live in today. But I think that can be changed. I think the interest in true liberty is growing, not diminishing. But the problems and the consequence of the last 100 years of this development of this authoritarian collectivism is hitting home, and it's struggling to survive with a free society versus the advancement stage to what Mises warned us about, and that is on to an authoritarian state like communism or any one of the others ruthless things. So that is the challenge, and it's up to people to do that. And we will not get it from our average college professor, but we have to get it from elsewhere. And that's where I get optimistic. There's more of it available. Yes, you have to pick and choose because there's a lot of trash out there, even in the internet. But we're on the internet, and I'll tell you what, we're participating in spreading a message. And I meet every day a new person that has their own theme and their own method of spreading this message. And I think that's what we should look to and encourage. And indeed, I want to thank everybody for that participation and for supporting our program. And please come back soon to the Liberty Report.
Professor Eckert shares many of the liberals' errors. He seems to regard and to denounce capitalism as a system of government coercion for the benefit of the rich. He seems to ascribe America's progress to government intervention into the economy. He does not question the government's right to initiate the use of physical force and to control the lives of the citizens for an alleged good purpose. He certainly does not challenge the morality of altruism. But he is too honest and conscientious an observer not to be disturbed by certain symptoms of the totalitarian spirit in the liberals' history, and he offers the evidence without identifying its full philosophical implications. For example, he offers the following quotation from The Promise of American Life by Herbert Crowley, a book published in 1909, which attacked the theory of laissez-faire and had an enormous influence on the so-called progressives of the time, on Theodore Roosevelt, among others. Quote, "The promise of American life is to be fulfilled not merely by a maximum amount of economic freedom, but by a certain measure of discipline. Not merely by the abundant satisfaction of individual desires, but by a large measure of individual subordination and self-denial. The automatic fulfillment of the American national promise is to be abandoned, if at all, precisely because the traditional American confidence in individual freedom has resulted in a morally and socially undesirable distribution of wealth. Close quotes. If you doubt the role of altruism in the destruction of capitalism, you may observe it in that quotation. And if you doubt the hatred of collectivists for the men of ability, observe it in the following passage from the same book by Crowley. Quote, "The national government must step in and discriminate, but it must discriminate not on behalf of liberty and the special individual, but on behalf of equality and the average man." Close quote. If you have been ascribing the policy of imperialism to the selfish individualistic ideology of capitalism and to its greed for conquests, here is a quotation from Ideals and Self-Interest in America's Foreign Relations by R.E. Osgood. Quote, "The spirit of imperialism was an exaltation of duty above rights, of collective welfare above individual self-interest, the heroic values as opposed to materialism, action instead of logic, the natural impulse rather than the pallid intellect." Close quote. If you have accepted the Marxist doctrine that capitalism leads to wars, read Professor E. Kirch's account of how Woodrow Wilson, the liberal reformer, pushed the United States into World War I. Quote, "He seemed to feel that the United States had a mission to spread its institutions, which he conceived as liberal and democratic, to the more benighted areas of the world." Close quote. It was not the selfish capitalists, nor the tycoons of big business, nor the greedy munition makers who helped Wilson to whip up a reluctant, peace-loving nation into the hysteria of a military crusade. It was the altruistic liberals of the magazine The New Republic, edited by that same Herbert Crowley. What sort of arguments did they use? Here is a sample from Crowley. Quote, "The American nation needs the tonic of a serious moral adventure." Close quote. If you still wonder about the singular recklessness with which alleged humanitarians treat such issues as force, violence, expropriation, enslavement, bloodshed, perhaps the following quote from Professor E. Kirch's book will give you some clue to their motives. Quote, "Stuart Chase rushed into print late in 1932 with a popular work on economics entitled A New Deal. Why, Chase asked with real envy at the close of his book, should Russia have all the fun of remaking a world?" Close quote. Apparently, Mr. Stuart Chase objects to this tyranny of words, but not to the tyranny of men. The record speaks for itself. Starting out as advocates of limited representative government, the liberals end as champions of unlimited totalitarian rule. Starting out as defenders of individual rights, they end as apologists for the bloody slaughterhouse of Soviet Russia. Starting out as apostles of human welfare who beg for a few temporary controls to relieve the emergency of people's need, they end with John Kenneth Galbraith, who demands controls for the sake of controls and a permanent cut of everybody's income, not because people are too poor, but because they are too affluent. Starting out as brave champions of freedom, they end crawling on their stomachs to Moscow with Bertrand Russell, pleading, "Give me slavery, but please don't give me death." Starting out as advocates of reason, confident of man's power to achieve well-being and fulfillment on earth, they end hunched in the darkest corners of the oldest cellar, muttering that reason is impotent and fumbling through musty pages for the occult guidance of Zen Buddhism. Such is the ultimate achievement of the altruist morality. Now I will ask you to consider the following. The intellectual trend that has brought us to this state, the mysticism, collectivism, altruism axis, has been gaining momentum since the 19th century, has been winning victory after victory, and is at present our dominant cultural power. If truth and reality were on its side, if it represented the right philosophy for men to live by, one would expect to see a gradual improvement in the state of the world with every successive victory, one would expect an atmosphere of growing confidence, liberation, energy, vitality, and joy of living. Is this what we have seen in the past decades? Is this what we see around us today? Today, in the moment of their almost total triumph, the voices of the mystic collectivist altruist axis are rising in a single wail of despair, proclaiming that existence on earth is evil, that futility is the essence of life, that disaster is man's metaphysical destiny, that man is a miserable failure, depraved by nature, and unfit to exist. This was not the way that the reason, individualism, capitalism axis greeted its triumphs in the 19th century, and this was not the view of man nor the sense of life that it brought to mankind. I quote from my book For the New Intellectual, quote, "The professional businessman and the professional intellectual came into existence together as brothers born of the Industrial Revolution. Both are the sons of capitalism, and if they perish, they will perish together. The tragic irony will be that they will have destroyed each other, and the major share of the guilt will belong to the intellectual." Close quote. Those of you who may still be liberals in the original sense of that word, and who may have abandoned everything except loyalty to reason, now is the time to check your premises. If you do, you will find that the ideal society had once been almost within man's reach. It was the intellectuals who destroyed it and who committed suicide in the process. But the future belongs to a new type of intellectual, a new radical, the fighter for capitalism.